Imperial Record 684 W56 ADG 55 plus System Dilender plus World, there's our Night World plus population, approximately 500 million plus notable assets, Castle of House Lyrock, Questoris Familia plus access to this report is reserved to those with the million level clearance only plus the Emperor protects plus. The two armies faced each other on the plains beyond the walls of Uruk, capital of the Lyrockian Empire. Soldiers on guard duty stared at the enemy lines, holding their weapons tight, ready to shout if the foe decided to launch a surprise attack. On the horizon, the sun was rising, a circle of white light among crimson skies. On both sides, soldiers emerged from their tents and began their morning rituals. They ate around their campfires, checked their weapons and armor, and spoke prayers for the souls of those who had fallen before, as well as their own. Theirs wasn't a kind world to its dead, their shades more often than not fell prey to the beasts that lurked in the underworld. As the preparations went on, the captive witches of both armies started to stir in their iron cages, scattered around the camps to draw the dark spirits to them and spare the soldiers their torments. They sensed the demons' agitation as the bloodshed drew near. Soon, the time would come, they screamed and wept, red tears flowing from their eyes. Soon, the carnage would begin. This battle had been long in the making, ever since the first cities had risen in rebellion against the Emperor, it had been inevitable. The Emperor had claimed that the rebels to his rule would be crushed long before things came to this, long before he was forced to leave his palace and lead his own forces to war, but he had been wrong. City after city had fallen to the rebellion, either through force of arms or, far more often, by joining its ranks. Now, after years of hiding behind those of his subjects who had remained loyal, the Emperor would finally meet those who rejected his tyranny in person. In mere numbers, the rebels surpassed the loyalists greatly. Only the most elite and indoctrinated troops, those whose cruel actions had guaranteed them execution at the rebels' hands, had elected to stand at their emperor's side, and fear of their wrath had forced others to do the same. In all, they numbered a few thousands, armed with a mix of swords, spears, shields and bows, constructed in the forges and workshops of the empire. Those among them with access to the emperor's vaults were equipped with the handful of ancient, priceless relics of their Tsar's past that remained, laser pistols, plasma cannons, and powered weapons. However, the battle wouldn't be decided by mortal men and women armed with mortal weapons killing each other, either for their cause or for their overlord. That had been the case of those which had come before, but this one would be different. On this battlefield, mortals would fight alongside demigods, whose fall or triumph would decide the course of the battle, and through it, that of the war. Imperial Knights, they were called. 10 meters high, shaped in the form of a man in armor and carrying weapons that could tear cities apart, they were the tools through which the Emperor's ancestors had established their absolute rule over their Tsar 300 years ago. In the old stories, passed over from parents to children for generations, the knights were noble protectors, mighty heroes that defended the weak from evil monsters. In service to the lords of the past, they had kept the people of their Tsar safe through the horrors of a war of such terrible scale. It made the current rebellion pale into insignificance. But that had been a long time ago, and many things had changed since the infamous day when the skies of their Tsar had turned crimson, and madness and hatred had rained from the heavens. On that day, the knights had led the charge against the legions of nightmares, and claimed victory, or so it had seemed. While outwardly defeated, darkness had crept inside the mechanical hearts of the knights, and slowly, over the course of generations, twisted them into monsters and all those who wielded their might into tyrants and slavers, ruling over the population of their Tsar through fear, strength of arm, and unholy pacts. Now, demons stalked the land unopposed, allowed by the knights to prey upon their people so long as they remained far from their strongholds. Yet in recent years, a new legend had begun to form. A tale of one knight that had returned to his duties of old, who defied the corruption that afflicted the rest of his house. His armor painted black and his heraldry obscured, the identity of that knight's pilot was shrouded in mystery, but his deeds echoed across all of their Tsar's free lands. He was the champion of the rebellion, harbinger of the empire's downfall. He had broken the walls of the Crossroad Fortress, and brought low Ultar the Cruel, regent of Marinda. In the Arresto Canyon, he had battled 3 Lyrockian knights sent by the Emperor to slay him, and emerged triumphant. These tales and many more circulated freely across the lands liberated by the rebellion, and in secret within those it had yet to reach. To the oppressed, the Black Knight, as he was known, was a symbol of hope, the promise of a better future. More than that, he was the symbol of human nobility, remaining pure in the front of their Tsar's corruption. There were some who claimed he was an ancient knight of the times before the madness, who had spent centuries slumbering after a great battle and had been awakened by the clamor of rebellion. Others were certain that he had descended from the heavens, drawn by the infamy of House Lyrock. Still more thought that he was one of the first rebels, who had slain a knight and claimed the armor as his own. There were 100 rumors and theories, constantly evolving with each retelling. But the truth is always more complex and less pristine than the legends the living make out of it. The man who emerged from the tent near the center of the camp was tall, and walked with a distinct nobility clear in his every motion. Though he was clad in a simple tunic, his bearing exuded the confidence and strength of one born to power. His dark hair was cut short, barely long enough to hide the sockets implanted in his skull. His face could have been called handsome, if it had not been marred by so many lines of worry and long-suffering pain. Eyes that were of the color the skies had once possessed stared straight ahead of him, seeming to pierce through all they saw. A plain sword hung from his belt, ready to be drawn at a moment's notice despite the fact that he was among allies. As he walked through the camp toward his mount, kept away from the rest of the army, Prince Eric could feel the gaze of his comrades on him. They at least had the courtesy of not whispering where he could hear them, though he knew the talks started the moment he left hearing range. In truth, he wasn't certain it was courtesy that held their tongues, it was just as likely fear that kept them from talking, fear of him and the power he wielded. It had been like that all of his life, though he had only started to notice it after the beginning of the war. One did not simply leave behind one's past as the only son of Emperor Augustus Lyrock. Before he had undergone the ritual of becoming, others had already feared him because of his father's shadow. Even now, after all that he had done for them, when the soldiers of the rebellion looked at him, they saw a member of House Lyrock. No matter how many battles he fought at their side, he was still one of the dread lords that had ruled their Tsar with an iron fist for 300 years. Fear of him was not just ingrained, it had become a survival necessity generations ago. Those who had never laid eyes upon him, who had only heard tales of the Black Knight's deeds, idolized him. But the moment they saw him, a terror so profound it transcended conscious thought shattered their delusions. Eric knew that the soldiers that guarded his tent every night were there as much for his own protection from enemy assassins as from members of his own army that wanted him dead. He told himself that it didn't matter. He had known what the consequences of his choice would be from the very beginning. He had chosen to honor his oaths, even if it were to cost him everything and give him nothing in return but a clear conscience when he died. After several minutes, he reached his night. The soldiers guarding it looked nervous, and seemed both relieved and afraid to see him arrive. He passed them with a nod, and stood before Indomitable. A handful of sacristans were working on the night, making last-minute repairs and checks. Once, that task would have been performed by dozens of them, but now there were less than a tenth of that number. Some of them had been servants of House Lyrock, who had followed their prince in his rebellion, while others had been captured by the rebels and escaped lynching long enough for Eric to conscript them into his service. Their loyalty was guaranteed by the fact that, without Eric's protection, they would be dead before the sun had set twice. They too scattered at his approach, not wanting to be nearby when the synchronization between mount and rider began. Only 2 of them remained, masking their nervousness. They were those who would guide Eric through the Union. As always, the sight of Indomitable caused Eric's heart to speed up. His relationship with the knight was complicated, but it was still a magnificent beast, worthy of legends. It was roughly humanoid in shape and covered in plates of a metal no living blacksmith could forge. It was painted in the blue of the rebellion, but with the prince's personal heraldry inscribed on its blazon, a hawk, holding a crown in its talons. The image of the crown had been altered after Eric had passed to the rebellion, now a crack ran through it. The fact that it had appeared on its own was seen as an omen by many, though none agreed on its significance. Indomitable was currently on its knees, its skull-faced helm open to reveal the pilot's seat. Eric climbed and sat inside. The 2 sacristans cautiously approached and lowered the restraining bars that would keep the prince from being tossed around once the knight started to move. They then each took one of the serpent-like cables, and, on Eric's signal, simultaneously plugged them into the 2 holes in the back of his skull. A surge of pain blackened Eric's vision, blinding him to the sight of the 2 sacristans jumping back before the cockpit closed in. The physical pain of the connection was short-lived, however, and swiftly replaced by the mental agony of Indomitable's presence in his very thoughts. The Night Spirit was a swirl of pure, undiluted rage. It hungered for destruction, and craved the spilling of blood. But it was also dimly aware that such was not its natural state. From what Eric had gathered in ancient texts, the Night Spirits were supposed to be like pack animals, fiercely dedicated to the protection of their flock. Indomitable knew that it was being driven mad by the corruption that held all of their Tsar in its grip, and this fueled its rage to a level that far surpassed that of any human emotion. The fury flowed through Eric's mind like lava, tainting his vision red, and for a terrible moment the prince wanted nothing more than to lash out, to unleash the full power at his disposal until everything around him was ash and ruin. He heard, in the far distance, the screams of tortured souls, echoes of the Knight's previous pilots, trapped forevermore in its corrupted mechanical brain. The screams reminded Eric that when he died and another was bound to Indomitable, there would be one more voice added to the choir. That knowledge only increased his fear, and for a few seconds, he teetered on the brink of the abyss, almost falling over and giving in to the Knight's rage. But Eric had been riding in Indomitable for more than 10 years, and the Knight's madness was as familiar to him as the machine's design. The sea of anger crashed on the walls of his iron will, not extinguished, but kept contained and sealed away from the rest of his thoughts. Soon, he promised the machine spirit, trying to convey his message through emotions rather than words. Soon we will wage war upon those who serve the source of our pain. Indomitable was far from appeased by the promise. In truth, it couldn't be appeased any more than the skies of their Tsar could be of any color besides red. But its anger receded slightly, enough for Eric's focus to turn outward. His dominance over Indomitable asserted once more. Eric flexed his will, testing his control of each of the Knight's limbs. Its right arm was a fire lance, described in the ancient texts as a thermal cannon. He could feel the heat trapped within the device's core, and once more marveled at the power that the creators of the Knights had possessed. The left arm was a more prosaic, but no less dreadful weapon. It was a chain blade the size of several men, and it roared to life as Eric's thoughts were directed to it. His weapons appearing to be in functioning order, Eric began to move. The Knight's limbs felt like his own, the sensors mimicking the sensation of his own body as he advanced with ponderous steps. Indomitable could be quick when necessary, but battle hadn't begun yet. It wouldn't do for Eric to devastate half the encampment on his way to his position, at the very front of the army. He passed before a portable shrine on a palanquin, held aloft by 4 devotees. A dozen warriors surrounded it, while the rest of the army gave it a wide berth. The shrine was a block of stone inscribed with emblems that mad oracles had seen in their nightmares, and a metallic 8-pointed star stood upon it, glowing with malevolent energy. That symbol was repeated on the warriors following the shrine, in tattoos and brands. Besides such marks, the devotees also bore more obvious signs of their faith, mutations bestowed by the dread powers to which they prayed and dedicated their kills. Zealots, Eric thought with a mixture of contempt and pity. Even among the rebellion, they were those who embraced the power of the warp, welcoming it into their flesh in return for the power it offered. An existence lived in the shadows of Knights pushed many in the Empire to seek power at any cost, hoping to free themselves of the constant terror. The prince could understand such sentiment, though his rank prevented him from experiencing it himself. But the idea of abandoning oneself to the beings that ruled over all demons, that, he couldn't understand, he didn't want to understand. While not outright forbidden, the practice was frowned upon in the lands controlled by the rebellion, for it was thought that such worship had been the source of the Empire's corruption. But the army needed all the fighters it could find, and so they were allowed to continue their worship. Despite their tenuous grasp on sanity, the zealots were fierce fighters, their fear of death the first thing they lost to their faith. The dubious gifts they received in return for their devotion, while often crippling, also made them more dangerous on the battlefield. Such worship, disgusting as Eric and others might find it, was nothing compared to that practiced by the Empire. On the other side of the field, the pre-battle human sacrifices had begun. Men and women covered in chains were dragged before the Knights, who crushed them beneath their boots, feeding their torment to the demons inhabiting their frames. As Eric watched this through Indomitable's senses, he sensed his mount's rising appetite at the spectacle. Though he had denied Indomitable such offerings long before he had turned against his father, the spirit of the machine still remembered it, and longed to know it anew. It was like a great hunger at the back of Eric's mind, as if he had not eaten in days and was presented with the smell of the most delicious of meals. Eric forced the hunger back, and felt the familiar, burning pain in his skull in response. Indomitable, for all that it now fought against its brethren, was still marked by the corruption that afflicted House Lyrock. Every time Eric entered the war machine, he feared that it would be the last time, that this time, he would lose the battle of wills against the night, and be consumed by the darkness that had found its way inside the once noble machine. He had sought the best sorcerers of the world, asking them to exorcise Indomitable, but all those who had been willing to try had failed, often meeting gruesome fates as the night rebelled against their attempts. In the end, the fallen prince had resigned himself to having to fight Indomitable's spirit every time he linked with the machine. At least there was no demon inside the night, as far as he was able to tell. The darkness inside it was purely the result of the original machine spirit's corruption. That meant that if he lost and was consumed, all that would result into would be his brain being fried. His soul would be as safe as any on their Tsar. In the Imperial camp, the sacrifices continued, dozens having already been offered to the demonic knights. The offerings would only stop once the bloodlust of the twisted machines had been temporarily sated, allowing their pilots to join with them without going through the same battle as Eric. In the last war council, the prince had risen the possibility of attacking before such sacrifices were complete. It took about an hour for the knights' hunger to be sated, and if they attacked at that time, the machines wouldn't be under anyone's control. They would rampage, slaughtering friend and foe alike until they were brought down. Such incidents had happened many times in the bloody history of House Lyrock. After several hours of heated debate, the proposal had been abandoned. Feral knights were just as dangerous as those with the rider in it, and there was always the risk that the demons possessing the knights would break free of their bonds in the chaos. Only once had such a thing happened, but the city of Petruska was still an empty graveyard, where the screams of the dead echoed forevermore. Though he had been the one to suggest it, Eric was glad that the idea had been rejected. Duty had demanded that he make the rebel leaders aware of the possibility, but it had sat poorly with him. Honor demanded that they confront the knights in battle, and defeat them to prove to the world that House Lyrock was no longer its master. Duty and honor, he thought to himself as the knight stopped in its final position, with the entire rebel army at its back. He felt Indomitable's spirit stir with something akin to recognition as the concepts passed through their bond. It had been for these things that he had turned on his house and joined the rebellion, for them that he endured the distrust of his comrades. And now, it was through them that the tyranny of the Lyrock would end. Communication had always been a keystone of any army in the galaxy's history. Without the ability to convey his instructions to the troops under his command, even the greatest general was powerless to alter the battle's outcome. Nowadays, the warlords of their Tsar were forced to resort to runners and signals, but in the past, they had been able to talk to their subordinates directly, no matter the distance that separated them. Vestiges of that capability remained, however. Fragments of Vox technology had survived the centuries of darkness that had followed the change of the skies. Every knight of House Lyrock was equipped with a long-range transmitter and receiver, and a handful of other, more primitive devices were scattered across both armies. One of those was in the hands of the general of the rebellion, and it had been very useful during the campaign, allowing Eric to coordinate with the rest of the army far more efficiently than his brothers and cousins had deigned do with their own troops. "Are you ready for this, Eric?" asked General Neria. "There will be no second chances. Either we destroy the Empire today, or all that we have accomplished will be for naught." General Neria had never served the Lyrockian Empire, unlike other officers of the rebellion who had turned against their masters. She had risen to her rank purely through skill, determination, and by climbing the corpses of her foes and fallen comrades. Now she was the supreme leader of the military arm of the rebellion, effectively the most powerful woman on the planet. Her tactical acumen far surpassed that of Eric, and every soldier in the army knew how valuable she was to their cause. In fact, they valued her so much that her own aides had forced her to renounce the idea of leading the battle herself. The prince knew that she was still angry about that, but it was for the best if she directed the battle from afar. "I am ready, General," he answered, knowing that his voice would be altered by Indomitable's systems. He had listened to recordings of his transmissions, and been shocked by the bestial tone of his own voice after it passed through the knight's mechanisms. "All right, then. Let us." The communication was interrupted by the interference of chatter on another frequency. Indomitable and Neria communicated with each other on private channels, the frequency of which was updated daily to prevent the foe from intercepting their messages. But when Eric read the display of his knight's sensor suits, he immediately recognized the frequency, and a cold hand grasped his heart. This was the frequency employed by the Emperor himself to give orders to the rest of his knights. Why would his father use it, though? He had to know Eric could listen on whatever was said. Which meant, "It seems that the Emperor wants to have a word with us," said Neria, coming to the same conclusion as Eric. The general had interrogated Eric at length on all that he knew of the Empire, and she too had recognized the frequency. "We should listen to what he has to say," suggested the prince. "Even if it's doubtlessly going to be rantings, he might let slip something important." With a sigh, Neria agreed, and Eric sent a pulse through his knight, commanding it to adapt to the Emperor's Vox channel. It took several seconds for his sensor suite to adjust, and just like he had felt the activation of the Emperor's Vox system, his father knew exactly when Eric could hear him clearly. "Emperor Augustus?" asked Neria. "I'm General Neria, leader of the people of Thesar's uprising. In the interests of saving lives, I urge you to surrender." "Be silent, wench," snarled Augustus, cutting the general off. The Emperor's voice was filled with hatred, but also strength. For all that he was an old man, Augustus had only managed to keep his throne by killing all those who dared to challenge him for it. "I have no time to waste on low-born such as you." His voice lost some of its bitterness when he addressed Eric, though it remained filled with anger. "Your childish defiance has cost me enough, son. It is time for this foolishness to end. Return by my side now, and I will forgive all that you have done against the Empire. I shall protect the people of Thesar from all threats, no matter what it might cost me," Eric recited, knowing the words by heart. "Do you remember these words, father? You must have heard them as I did, when you walked the Ancestors' Hall and confronted the spirit of your knight. Even when so much of the ritual of becoming was corrupted over the years, these words endured. Amidst all the madness of the Ancestors' Hall, this kernel of truth remained, embodying all that the knights were supposed to stand for. You swore that oath just like I did. And if House Lyrock is the threat, then I shall fight to destroy it, just like our ancestors fought against the legions of hell 300 years ago." "These people you claim to fight for only live because we fought," replied the Emperor, every syllable dripping with condescension and arrogance. "Without House Lyrock, they would all have died at the demon's claws hundreds of years ago. We are the only reason this world isn't a graveyard, and as such, their lives belong to us, to do with as we see fit. Such is the will of the gods." Then, without warning, the skies darkened as a giant shadow blotted out the sun. A blanket of silence fell upon the two armies as thousands of heads were raised toward the heavens. Indomitable turned its attention toward the source of the sudden darkness, measuring its form and triangulating its distance. After a few heartbeats, the calculations were complete, and for a moment Eric doubted what the knight's sensors were telling him. The source of the shadow was a metallic object 12 kilometers long, hanging above the battlefield like a leviathan of ancient myths come to eat the sun. Smaller objects rained from it, cone-shaped meteors that left a trail of fire in their wake as they fell toward the ground. They hammered into Thesar's surface with the sound of the god's wrath, and from the craters they left silhouettes emerged. Recognition dawned within Indomitable's machine spirit as the forms resolved into the aspect of men in armor of black and gold, carrying chainswords and strange weapons that the knight's ancient memory recognized as bolters. A name emerged from the depths of the knight's spirit, filled with terrible might and echoing with legends, Astartes. A flow of images poured into Eric's consciousness, and he saw legions of such beings wage war against creatures he couldn't identify, and then against each other. He saw an army of such warriors, clad in dark blue and brass with lightning strikes, come to Thesar in the days before the heavens' madness. He felt Indomitable's rage as it and his pilot had fought to defend the world from them. He smelled the scent of burning flesh as the knight walked through ruined cities, forcing the Astartes to abandon the planet and leave in search of easier prey. Behind the meteors, drop pods, the name flashed in his mind, came several flying contraptions of metal, howling as they descended and landed on the ground with far more care. From their own bellies came more warriors, as well as machines that, while smaller than the knights, were still imposing and bristling with weapons. Where it had taken both Imperial and Rebel armies hours to get into position, these new arrivals formed up in minutes of their landing, creating a new force to the east of both armies. The voices of both Emperor and General faded away, and for a few seconds Eric was left alone on the Vox channel. Then, an impossibly deep voice reached him. "Greetings, Prince Eric. I am Arkan, Lord of the Forsaken Sons." "How do you know my name?" asked Eric, trying not to let his tension show in his voice. The voice could belong to no other than the leader of the Astartes. "I know many things, young prince. This one is of no interest to you, at least not compared to the rest of what I know. Aren't you curious as to why and how me and my brothers came here?" "The question had crossed my mind," admitted Eric. "Your father called for help," the warlord explained. "In the dark temples of Oruk, he offered 1,000 sacrifices to the powers, sending a message across the void. My sorcerers heard that message, and I came here with my warriors to see for myself what had caused it." Eric gritted his teeth together. Though the new arrivals only numbered a few hundreds, each of them was a giant in armor, and the beasts of metals they had brought with them, while smaller than the knights, were none the less threatening in aspect. This battle, which was always going to be a close thing, had just become desperate. "Unless. Are you here to aid my father, then? Have you really come to this world to help a corrupt tyrant clutch to his throne?" There was a strange sound over the Vox, repetitive and inhumane, that made the spirit of Indomitable groan with unease. It took a few seconds for Eric to recognize it as what passed for the laughter of the one he was talking to. There was no joy in the sound, no amusement whatsoever. He had no idea what kind of emotion, if any, it was supposed to express. "No," said Arkan at last, "we have not. This little emperor might believe that we have come here in answer to his prayers, and is doubtlessly celebrating as we speak, but I have never talked with him as I now do with you. We have no alliance with him, no pact of any kind." Then, Eric hesitated. He knew his next words would have consequences. But there was no other way. "What would it cost me to secure your aid in this battle for the rebellion instead?" There was a moment of silence, then the chilling laugh again. It lasted longer this time, and contained something a little closer to joy than the last. "I like you already, Prince. Not asking whether or not an alliance is possible and straight to asking what the price would be? You do not lack audacity, I will give you that. As for the price, I want your oath, Eric of House Lyrock. When this battle is over and your rebellion is victorious, you will follow me and my brothers into the void, and fight alongside us in the wars that await us." "I swore an oath to defend the people of their Tsar," protested Eric. I will not break this oath." "Come on, Prince. You know what will happen after this battle is over. The people of their Tsar might believe in the Black Knight, but the leaders of the rebellion won't tolerate your existence. They will consider you a threat to their power, a seed through which the empire might regrow. They will kill you, and if they mess it up, your death might cause another war. That way, you will quietly remove yourself from the board, without them risking to alienate the population. Unless you plan to take over the rebellion and become emperor yourself. If that is your goal, I am sure we can negotiate another deal." "No," snarled Eric. "Such is not my intent. I accept your offer. If you help defeat my father's army, then, should I survive this battle, me and my sacristans shall come with you and serve you faithfully till death takes us." "Very well," accepted Arkan. "We will even take care of the other knight's remains. After all, you wouldn't want someone else to use them, now would you?" And on these words, the warlord's voice was gone, and the interference disappeared. Eric quickly raised General Neria, his call answered immediately. "Eric. Who are these warriors?" "Allies," answered the prince, the taste of ash in his mouth as he spoke the word. "I have made a deal with their leader. They will fight against the Empire, and I will follow them into the void after that." "Follow them? Eric, you—" "There was no choice, General," he interrupted. "These are Astartes, Indomitable knows their kind. If they fought against us, we would not stand a chance. Losing me would be worth it if only to get them to stay uninvolved. In return for their aid, it is practically a bargain. You said it yourself, we cannot allow ourselves to lose this battle," he continued, hammering his point in. "Focus on the battle, General." "Very well." The audio communication ended on Neria's end, and a handful of seconds later, one last signal came through the channel, the order to advance. At Eric's command, Indomitable lurched forward, followed by the rest of the rebel army, a mighty roar of defiance rising from every throat. The arrival of the flying Leviathan and the descent of the great warriors and their beasts of metal had shaken them, but they had been ready to die for their cause for years. Halfway to the Imperial army, it became obvious to all those present on the battlefield that the Sky Warriors were charging the Empire's forces as well, and morale swelled among the rebels. Simultaneously, terror filled the hearts of the Imperials, and fury those of the knights at this betrayal from those they had thought had been sent to their aid by the gods. Then the three armies smashed together, and nothing mattered anymore, save for the clashing of blades and the duels of giants. The roar of war eclipsed everything. Almost lost in the rage of his mount, Eric had no time to pay attention to the wider battle. He knew Neria would take care of the tactical aspect of the fight, directing her troops with maximal efficiency. Such was their long-standing arrangement. His task was to defeat the enemy knights, and he waded through enemy hordes to confront them. Training, experience, and the instincts of centuries-dead pilots guided his every blow as he and Indomitable tore a path toward their fallen kindred. Most of Eric's will was focused on keeping Indomitable from turning on the rebel soldiers and directing the knights' raid toward the Imperial army. His consciousness of the moment faded as his mind passed into a state of battle awareness. Only glimpses of what his knight's senses perceived made it through to the fog of Indomitables and his fury. He saw lances of lightning burst from the cannons of the Forsaken Sun's war machines and ram into his cousin Adrian's knight, Undying Lord. The bloated knight exploded in a rain of corroded metal and pestilent growths, its iron shield overwhelmed by the combined fire. A chorus of sirens screamed the Emperor's ire, and half of the remaining knights turned toward the oncoming Astartes, leaving only 3 for Eric and the rebellion to deal with. Indomitable's gaze directed toward each of them in turn, its pilot recognizing each of them instantly. At the forefront of the charge was Decimator, the knight of his brother Marcus. Decimator had long fallen to the battle madness, and its chest bore a stylized skull rune that glared at the world before it with baleful eyes. It was covered in the dried blood of past victims and sacrifices. No sacristan dared to approach it for something as mundane as cleaning, for the knight was ever hungry for slaughter. Both of its arms had mutated into giant, two-headed axes, and it wielded them in savage sweeps that tore dozens of soldiers to bloody pieces. Adraxa, the mount of Eric's cousin Petrosius, though in truth he had never been certain which had been the master in their union, came next. In appearance, Adraxa looked much similar to Indomitable, and carried the same array of weapons. But blue flames flickered over its armor, and Eric could sense a malevolent intelligence in the knight's eye-shaped sensors. When the prince had turned against the rest of the house, Petrosius had already been inside the knight for several months, refusing all appeals for him to leave it. Eric wasn't sure that his cousin had emerged from Adraxa in the following months. Indeed, he wasn't sure his cousin still existed at all within the corrupt knight's pilot seat. The Emperor's knight was, as was only fitting, the most powerful of the entire household. Its name, inscribed in golden letters upon its shoulder, was Nessus. Its face had been shaped by mortal artisans and demonic influence into a horned skull that leered down on all those who came before it. Its right arm was a chainsword, identical to that carried by Eric's knight, but its left upper limb had been replaced by a cluster of 5 meters long tentacles that twisted in the air, picking up rebel and imperial soldiers alike and crushing them to pulp, absorbing the bloody remains with horrifying suction noises. This trio of unholy giants charged into the rebel army with reckless abandon, uncaring of how many of their own troops they crushed underfoot. Decimator was the first to make contact with Eric, far ahead of the rest of the army, its axes dripping with gore. The 2 weapons came down on Indomitable, only to be blocked by the rebel knight's chainsword. Eric groaned as Marcus tried to overpower him, roaring his fury at him as he did so. With a monumental effort that twisted the metal of Indomitable's joints, Eric forced the 2 axes aside. Decimator stumbled, its balance broken, and Eric seized the opportunity to run into his foe, forcing it to take a step back or fall to the ground. As Decimator restored its balance, Eric brought his own chainsword around in a sweeping arc, smashing the axes aside before bringing his weapon back. In a flurry that the side of the knight would have made seem impossible, he brought the chainsword up and rammed it into Decimator's chest from below, impaling the pilot's seat in a shower of sparks and blood that was entirely too red to belong to a machine. Decimator fell, its twin consciousness severed in a single blow, and Eric scanned his surroundings for his next foe. Some distance away, Adraxa was being dragged down by several squads of night killers working together. These warriors were the bravest of the rebels, and were equipped with weapons capable of piercing the knight's armor, and carried thick cables that could be used to topple the war machines. Eric watched as Adraxa collapsed, and was immediately set upon by fighters carrying long, sparkling spears. Like a great beast, the knight was pierced over and over, screaming its pain and rage at every blow. Several of the slayers were caught in the blue fire that covered the knight, and screamed briefly as their burnt flesh was stripped from blackened bones. But the survivors endured, and soon, Adraxa wails turned to despair, before finally falling silent. Now Nessus was the only Imperial knight remaining standing, and it charged toward Indomitable while Augustus spat his hatred at his son. No longer did the Emperor use the Vox channel, instead, he roared through the Vox speakers of his knight, letting all hear his words. "Traitorous, unworthy bastard! I will kill you, even should it be the last thing I ever do." Eric ignored his father's hateful declaration. The time for words had passed, now was the time for battle. History was rushing toward them. The confrontation of the prince and emperor would decide the fate of their Tsar. Should he fall here, Eric would be unable to honor his bargain with the Forsaken Sons, and there was no telling what price Archon would exact upon the planet's population in return for his aid in toppling the empire. A volley of projectiles burst from Nessus' shoulder cannons, and Eric redirected his iron shield forward. The bullets smashed into the protective field, most of them failing to pierce through. The handful that made it did little more than scorch the paint of Indomitable and rise the ire of the knight's machine spirit even further. The two knights clashed, their chainswords coming together in a shower of sparks and metal fragments as they bit at each other. "Unworthy," growled Augustus. "You are nothing but a colossal disappointment." Before Eric could react, Nessus brought up its swarm of tentacles, and the repugnant appendages hurled themselves at Indomitable, smashing across the knight's top half and attaching themselves to the metal plates with suckers whose teeth bit through the venerable metal. Sympathetic pain surged through the prince's mind at these attacks, but it was as nothing compared to the assault on his mind. The tentacles generated some kind of unholy fluid that dripped into Indomitable's gears, instantly brought to ebullition by the machine's heat. Vapors filled the cockpit, and Eric choked on the smoke. Horrific visions swarmed Eric's mind as the tentacles struggled to find a way into his cockpit and to his flesh. He felt the bites of countless snakes, and saw images of pale limbs and claws. Coming from beyond the veil of reality, these visions seared into his brain like white-hot coals, and he screamed in abject pain. Indomitable reacted to his distress with wild motions of its chainsword, trying to sever the tentacles and free itself from their hideous embrace, but in vain. Deliverance came from a most unexpected quarter. One of the Forsaken Sons' tanks opened fire on Nessus, turrets from both of its sides focusing a cascade of laser fire on the Emperor's knight. The rays of killing light blasted through Nessus' iron shield and melted its left leg to slag. With a terrifying scream of pain, the knight vacillated, before its tentacles removed themselves from Indomitable with lightning speed and tensed toward the ground, preserving Nessus' balance. As the embrace of the tentacles retired, so did the fog of nightmares clouding Eric's mind, receding before Indomitable's rage. This time, the prince did not attempt to contain his knight's fury, he let it rage through his psyche, purifying him from the taint of the poisoned fumes. His vision cleared, his mind sharpened to a razor's edge, and he saw what he had to do to claim victory. Though wounded, Nessus was still a nimble creature, its tentacles perhaps even swifter to react than its missing leg had been. The opening born from its pilot adjusting to the change in balance lasted only a fraction of a second. Guided by the ghosts of a score of previous pilots, pushed by the righteous rage he and his mount shared, Eric rammed his chainsword into the opening, feeling as if it were his own hand on the blade pushing it through his father's chest. A dark, oily liquid burst from the wound with the strength of arterial blood, covering Indomitable's front armor. Nessus struggled, both the knight's corrupt machine spirit and the cockpit's occupant refusing to accept their defeat. With a roar, Eric brought Indomitable's fire lance up, pointing it straight at the head of his father's mount. The cannon rested directly on the leering skull, and began its heating cycle, the characteristic humming a herald of the devastation that would come in mere seconds. Something that could only be described as a moan emerged from Nessus' damaged Vox speakers, and Eric fancied that, among the rage and the despair, he could hear a note of relief in his father's scream. Then, the weapon fired. A ball of fire as bright as a newborn sun manifested, eating through Nessus' armor like paper. Within the night, Emperor Augustus Lyrock had no time to scream, or to suffer. His body was vaporized in a fraction of a second, his soul cast to the underworld, where the beasts his many sins had spawned waited. Nessus' headless body fell heavily to the ground, and Eric tore his chainsword free of the vanquished knight. When he looked around him, he saw the crowds of the rebel army cheering as the last imperial regiments either dropped their weapons and surrendered, or tried to flee the field. The fall of their emperor was the final blow to their morale, already damaged by the attacks of the Forsaken Sons and the death of every other knight fighting for the empire. In the distance, the great gates of Uruk were opening, and smoke rose from the city. Doubtlessly, with the sight of their master's fall, the people of the capital had risen against what few guards remained. If order wasn't re-established soon, the city would burn to the ground, and many of those who had just been freed would die in the fires they themselves had started. But this was no longer his concern, Eric reminded himself. House Lyrock was no more, the people of their Tsar were now masters of their own fate. As for him, another destiny awaited him. Indomitable turned, and Eric looked at where the forces of the Forsaken Sons stood. Already more flying machines were descending from their great ship, to bring them back aboard it, their part in the war over. Near the corpse of Avenger, his brother Ulceus Knight, a hulking, bare-headed giant stared in the prince's direction. He knew without being told that this was Archon, the lord of this army that his father's pleas had brought to their Tsar. For an instant, the temptation to open fire on the Astartes nearly overwhelmed him. He could see the sigils many of them wore, the same emblems of the Zealots. He knew that these warriors bore within them the same taint that had driven his family to madness and forced his hand against his own kin. But reason quickly reasserted itself. If he attacked the Forsaken Sons, the rest of the army would follow his lead, and they would all die. The vision of the midnight-clad warriors that had ravaged their Tsar in centuries past was still present in his mind. With only one remaining knight, there was no chance of victory. Even if the Astartes immediately left afterward, the population would be left defenseless against the demonic predators. There was only one path that duty allowed. With a heavy heart, the last scion of House Lyrock turned his back on the cheering rebels, and commanded his mount to advance toward its new masters. The Forsaken Sons stood alone among the dead, gathering their wounded and taking trophies from their defeated foes. None of their number had died in the battle, but those who had been harmed would be the subject of much mockery from their brothers. To have been wounded by primitive swords and arrows was shameful for any space marine. Transports were descending from orbit, troop carriers, and one heavy Mechonicus craft that would bring the knight that had sworn loyalty to the Warband to the ship. For all that they had fought together, most of the local rebels didn't dare to come near the transhuman warriors. Only those who had fought under Chaos Icons flocked to them, instinctively drawn by the favor of the Dark Gods. Already warriors who had once been word-bearers were leaving their packs to talk with these lesser servants of ruin. Before long, the mortals would have been introduced to the true glory of the Pantheon, and they would follow their transhuman lords into the stars. Though it hadn't been the purpose of their coming to this world, the Forsaken Sons could always use more fighters, and these had proven their worth already by surviving the war against House Lyrock. In the distance, the Knight of Prince Eric was also marching toward them, a small group of attendants rushing to keep up with him. 300 Astartes had come to their Tsar, all of them having painted their armor to the colors of the Warband, and led by Archon himself. They were those who had proven to be the most dedicated to the Awakened One, and formed almost the entirety of the Space Marine contingent aboard the Hand of Ruin. The ship hung in low orbit. On any conventional world, such proximity would have caused the vessel to be caught in the planet's gravity and send it crashing to the ground. But gravity, the force that held much of the physical universe together, was but another plaything to the powers of chaos. Kodlak, the Hand of Ruin's shipmaster, had trusted the words of his Auspex crew and obeyed the command of Archon, bringing the ship into position for optimal troop delivery and shock value. After the victory at Paraxis, Archon had decreed that no force remained in the wailing storm that could oppose the Warband. He had spent several days studying the data available on the worlds trapped within the warp storm, now stabilized by the anchoring. Then, he had divided the Warband into several forces. Each of these groups was led by one of his trusted lieutenants, and tasked with visiting a series of worlds in the Trebedius sector, to take what resources and troops they could provide. Once all worlds had been brought under the Forsaken Sons' control, the Warband would muster again. To what purpose, Archon hadn't said. So far, the journey to their Tsar had proven most profitable. At almost no cost, they had gained the services of a knight-errant, a few hundreds of foot soldiers, and the wreckage of the knights which had fought for the Empire. Demarian had seen the strength of the knights during the Great Crusade and the heresy. On Moloch, a pack of them had brought low an Imperator-class Titan. Even the services of one such war machine would have been worth the journey. The potential of having several of them fight for the Warband, as well as Mercurian learning how to build more, was truly a gift from the Dark Gods. "What do you think will happen to this world after we have left?" asked Demarian. The Terminator-clad bodyguard stood near his master, near a fallen knight that was being taken apart by servitors under the direction of a warpsmith. "This world has lost much of its technology, and is deeply permeated with the warp," replied Arkin. "The only reason the Neverborn haven't consumed the entire population long ago was the protection of the knights, regardless of their own actions against the humans. Now, I suppose it depends on how this rebellion handles matters. If they manage to gather enough troops in the aftermath, they might be able to keep their population relatively safe. Human worlds with less resources survived through Old Night, and the storms that raged then were much worse than the one we have unleashed. Mankind is more tenacious than we believe it to be, brother." There passed a moment of silence between Demarian and his master. Then, Arkan said, "You have something to say, brother?" The words of the Awakened One might have been phrased as a question, but Demarian knew that they were really in order for him to speak up. Even if Arkan had lost access to the Oracle's predictions in the aftermath of the Paraxis campaign, the Chaos Lord still possessed insight beyond the ken of most of the gods chosen. Some of it was the result of warp alterations granted to him by the powers, but most simply came from centuries of leading soldiers to war. The prince turned against his father because of his actions offended his sense of morality, Demarian pointed. "We aren't exactly stellar examples of that either, my lord. What prevents him from turning against us at the worst possible time?" Arkan smiled, the sight sending a shiver down Demarian's spine despite his familiarity with his lord's facial expressions. The Awakened One's armor had been repaired, the emblem of the chained demon head now emblazoned on his chest. His lightning claws dripped with blood. The Chaos Lord had fought at the side of his brothers for the first time since they had left Paraxis, and the mortals arrayed against them had been no challenge. The Imperial Knights had been the only true threat, and the tanks the Warband had brought with it had been able to defeat them before they had gotten too close. In truth, Demarian had been surprised at how easy the battle had been for the Astartes. Clearly, House Lyrock had devolved greatly since the coming of the Wailing Storm. Such was always the fate of those too weak to withstand the power of chaos. But the prince was clearly different, which was the cause for his unease. "He has given us his oath, brother," replied Arkan. "From what I gathered, it is quite important to him." Demarian stayed silent, simply staring at his master in disbelief. Arkan chuckled, the sound as dry as the core of a sun, before admitting, "Besides, his knight was damaged in that battle. It will require maintenance once we bring it aboard the Hand of Ruin, and Mercurian is eager to work on it in person. If our dear prince chooses to turn on us, there will be contingencies in place. And we still have the other knights to repair, and grant to pilots of our own choosing. These things are more demon than machine," Demarian pointed out, gesturing toward the fallen knight. As he did so, the giant jerked in motion for less than a second, tearing a handful of minions apart with its chainsword and causing the rest to scatter in terror. It will take time even for the Techno-Adept to unlock their secrets and fix them. "Oh, that won't be a problem. We will have plenty of time before we need these knights, brother." Adeptus Mechanicus Data Entry 10,011,010,110 plus System Iraset plus World, Argenta Primus, Forge World plus Population, 31,954,628,727 as of the last census plus Unique Assets, 3 Mining Moons plus access to this report is reserved to the Scions of Omnissiah of Margus rank and above plus the machine knows all, praise be to the machine plus. Omicron 193, fourth of the name, walked briskly through the halls of his master's domain. All around him, he could feel the never-ending agitation of the city, the sounds of an industry blessed by the eightfold Omnissiah and the dark powers, a chorus of praise to the glory of the demonic machine. Of all the forged temples of Argenta Primus, Illuria was the greatest, for it stood directly beneath the great device and benefited the most from its bounty. After a final flight of stairs, He emerged onto the platform at the center of which rose the tower of the Fabricator General. There was no access into the sanctum of the world's master except for the massive double doors at the tower's foot, and the platform itself was exposed to the elements, revealing the glorious sight of Argenta Primus in all directions, and the pollution-clouded sky above. But isolation was far from the only defense of the Fabricator General. A collection of demon engines strolled the platform, and as Omicron settled a foot in their domain, they turned their hungry gaze to him at once. As he passed between ranks of guarding constructs, he felt the Neverborn bound to their metallic shells scrutinize him, looking at his very soul before grudgingly acknowledging his right to be there and abandoning the idea of devouring him, for now, at least. 99 demon engines guarded the Fabricator General's quarters, each crafted personally by the arch-heretic in the days before his ascension to ruler of the world and infused with the essence of a warp-born entity summoned and pacted through the sacrifices of hundreds of slaves. Collectively, they were known as the Calastilal, and many would-be spies and assassins had been discovered by them. These failed infiltrators were then quickly consigned to a fate far worse than death, their flesh and augmetics consumed and their soul burning forevermore in the beast's infernal guts. The Calastilal let him pass, and the double doors to his master's chamber opened slowly, after a final check of his identity by the digital minds trapped within their metal. The dark magi of Argenta Primus were nothing if not thorough in their paranoia. Clutching in his hands the sealed roll of parchment he had come to deliver, Omicron passed through the threshold, the gate closing behind him with a loud clang and the sounds of hundreds of locks putting themselves back into place. The room was vast in every dimension. The entire tower was hollow, with cables dancing through its entire height as they channeled the energy of the great device downward. This was Argenta Primus' most sacred place, and none save for the Fabricator General and his most trusted servants ever entered it. Yet it was devoid of any accommodations that could have been found in the sanctum of a mere human lord. There were no beds, no seats or desk, no shelves and marks of wealth. Instead, most of it was filled by row upon row of immaterial cogitators, handling the monstrous calculations required to the operation of the great device, each covered in wards that protected the sentiences within from immaterial corruption. There was only a single path through them, and Omicron took it, his outer ports filling with shreds of code escaping the cogitators. Omicron 193's ocular implants had been designed by the best dark magi of the Forge City, and they saw far more than the mere fraction of the light spectrum his natural eyes had been able to perceive. Beyond the rows of cogitators that toiled endlessly in the crimson illumination given by their blinking indicators, he saw what was really taking place in his master's sanctum. He saw the power coursing through the thick bundles of cables going down the chamber's roof, where the central collector was located. As ever, the sight of the miracle through which all of Argenta Primus was preserved from the evil of power starvation filled him with religious fervor. It was almost enough to make him forget the dread he also felt every time he was in the presence of his master, almost, but not quite. He doubted anything but the complete liberation from his flawed flesh would ever be enough to accomplish that. Elveros Anestis, sixth master of the Conduit and Fabricator General of Argenta Primus, stood at the center of a nest of cables and maintenance servitors, each of which was directly controlled by the arch-heretic as it worked on maintaining his unnatural existence. As befitted a scion of the dark mechanicum of his rank, Elvero's original body was all but gone, replaced and improved into his own vision of dread perfection by both augmentations and demonic gifts. The result was a vision straight out of a nightmare. Inside a nest of cables and organic tubes, a single, giant and unblinking eye pulsed with unnatural light as it stared at Omicron 193. The cables were so thick that they formed a pillar from the room's floor to its roof. Elveros had fused with the room's machinery, becoming a part of the great device. Every spark of energy the wondrous engine produced coursed through his unhallowed form before being spread to the rest of the forged world, and it was his will alone that decided the allotment of each dark forge on its surface. So did the arch-heretic held absolute power over his dominion. "My Fabricator General," Omicron greeted his master with a bow. An unknown ship entered the range of our detection arrays 764.93 seconds ago. "Why wasn't that ship captured by our fleet?" came Elvero's voice, from a dozen Vox speakers at once. Despite his monstrous appearance, it was a human voice, free of any taint. The arch-heretic could change the tonality of his voice at will, and did so often. Today, he had chosen to sound like an old man. "Is it that powerful that it would make our captains hesitate?" "No, my master." She is a single, small merchant frigate, though she has received upgrades from someone clearly versed in the same arts we pursue. It is the identification codes she broadcasts that gave our captains pause and made them ask for instructions. What about these codes? They bear the mark of the 15th Adeptus Astartes Legion, my lord. The sons of murdered Prospero have come to Argenta Primus. There was a moment of pause, no doubt as Alvaro's consciousness brought up all that he knew of the 15th Legion and their war-bred kindred. Finally, the Fabricator General asked, "Why have they come?" "I have the exact message here, Master," said Omicron, holding up the parchment before Alvaro's optics. It only took a fraction of a second for the arch-heretic to read it completely. Then again, it wasn't especially long, though very respectfully composed. Omicron, of course, already knew the message's contents. The renegade Space Marines had come to seek an alliance, an alignment of purpose as fellow enemies of the Golden Throne and the false Omnissiah. They claimed to be emissaries of a greater power, one who aimed to unify all worlds within the warp space anomaly under his banner. They had offered to share with the heretics of Argenta Primus great and terrible secrets in return for their support. Most important of all, they sought an audience with the planet's ruler. "Very interesting," said the arch-heretic after his reading was complete. "Who else knows of this?" "The message wasn't encrypted, my lord. All with ears among the fleet or on the ground will have heard of it by now." "I see," replied the Fabricator General, before abruptly asking, "Tell me, faithful Omicron 193, what is the current situation on Argenta Primus according to the latest reports of our observers in the other forges?" Omicron took an instant to access the relevant data stored in his inner cogitators. "Production is up to schedule in all forges. There has been a decrease in the amount of transdimensional incursions of 17.1657% this month. The assembly of the fleet in orbit is also progressing well." "Enough," interrupted Alvaros. "Don't try to stall. Tell me what my faithful servant Haenorius has been up to." Omicron hesitated for all of a quarter of a second, before admitting, "There have been signs of stirring in the Ultio Maxima Forge Temple for several weeks, my lord. 7 of our hidden agents there have failed to report in accordance to their protocols, and there have been peaks of power usage apparently unrelated to the Forge's planned production. If Haenorius is going to finally make his move against me, an alliance with an Astartes force might force him to reconsider his course of action," mused the Dark Mechanicum Lord. "For years now, Tevres Haenorius, arch-heretic of Argenta Primus, master of Ultio Maxima, the Chasm City, and dreaded Lord of Machines, among many other titles, had been the principal threat to the rule of Elveros and Estus. Haenorius commanded legions of Scutari and demon engines, and had managed to put many of his disciples within the fleet. Omicron's master knew that Haenorius was planning to overthrow him, he just didn't know when, or how. "With respect, master," interjected Omicron, "this vessel is hardly enough to affect the arch-heretic decision pattern. Even if she was filled to capacity with Astartes, it wouldn't be enough. Remember, my faithful servant, they are emissaries. If they had come in greater number, we would have seen it as a threat, and any negotiations that would have followed would have been undergone under tension." Omicron remained silent. It wasn't his place to question his master's reasoning, only to serve. Over the years of his service to Elveros and Estus, he had seen many magi deraise in objection to his will. In a few very, very rare cases, when they offered genuinely valuable advice, they had gotten away with it. Far more frequently, however, they had been dragged outside the forge and cast out for the various technophage beasts that haunted the wasteland between forge cities. No arch-heretic rose to an Estus station without displaying his ruthlessness to both his servants and his peers. "I have sent a reply," declared Elveros at last. "Assemble an escort of our best constructs and go welcome our guests in Hangar 78. Be careful about its composition, it must show what we have to offer without appearing threatening. They have shown us this much courtesy, let us return it." "As you command, my lord," answered Omicron, bowing once more before leaving his master's chamber. Omicron walked out as fast as was possible without breaking decorum, sending messages down encrypted channels to command the assembly of an appropriate group of soldiers. Ensuring that the communication wasn't intercepted was only the most obvious part of his duty, the most important was to keep up appearances that all was going on as it always did. Even here, at the heart of Arch-Heretic and Estus power base, there could be eyes belonging to the Fabricator General's many rivals. If he appeared to be in a rush, it could weaken his master's position. Such was but one of the thousands of rules that made up the great game of powers and lies that had held all of Argenta Primus in its grip for hundreds of years. Omicron had not been born when the skies of the Forged World had first turned crimson, and the veil between the Materium and the Ethereal Dominion had grown thin. By the time his body of flesh had been assembled in one of Illuria's many gene mills, more than a century had passed since that blessed day, when the Magi of the world had begun to walk the path of true illumination. It still amazed Omicron, how his forebears had been limited in their vision, shackled to the dictates of the false Emperor of Terror. Because of the lies of a false prophet, they had willingly ignored countless avenues of research, and abandoned the pursuit of innovation in favor of blindly worshipping the ruins left by those that had come before. But when the raging powers of the Empyrean had been unleashed, many of Argenta Primus Magi had finally seen the truth. Not all, though, and what had followed had been as predictable as it had been wasteful. Many had refused to embrace the glorious truth, and conflict had raged across the Forged World. Magi and the Tagmata Omnissiah forces under their command chose one side or the other. There could be no neutrality in such a war, and their armies clashed on the desert plains separating each forged city. Even now, decades after the Illuminated had finally triumphed over their blind kindred, there were groups of scavenger drones picking up the debris of these battles, searching for anything that could be reused. It had been during this war that the term of heretic had been heaped upon those who rejected the stifling doctrine of the hidebound Adeptus Mechanicus. But instead of seeing it as an insult, the rebels had embraced the appellation as a proud title. They knew the word was a corruption of the Low Gothic heretic, and also knew the actual meaning of that word. To be a heretic was to refuse to conform to whatever doctrine dominated the existing culture. To be an heretic was to refuse to accept the limitations of existing knowledge, and to pursue the advancement of technology at all costs, rejecting all petty limitations. Only by being an heretic, by not bowing to any dogma, could one hope to uncover the truths of the universe. By consorting with the dark powers of the warp, the Magi of Argenta Primus had uncovered secret truths that had changed their perception of the universe forever, and enabled them to create wonders of terrible power. Rather than serving a distant, silent, and in all likelihood non-existent God through endless repetition, they had become lords of the material and immaterial planes, actors of their own destinies rather than pawns of uncaring masters. Of course, this had not come without a price, for the path of the Eightfold Omnissiah was unkind to the weak. Despite his augmented mind, Omicron 193 had long lost count of how many assassination attempts he had avoided, or how many of his rivals he himself had ordered executed. Almost a third of his cogitator's abilities were permanently slaved to security protocols, scanning his surroundings through a dozen different senses in search of any threat. It was these sensors that warned him of someone approaching him. Several defense mechanisms started to activate before the newcomer's identification codes reached him. They were the squad he had ordered to join him to meet the Astartes envoys. 20 Scutari fell in line around him, forming a protective circle as they advanced toward the hangar where their visitors had been permitted to land. Despite their unity of motion, brought about by the single overmind that dominated their warp-touched cogitators, not two of the cybernetic warriors were identical. The Dark Magi despised the uniformity that they had once so blindly embraced, and this was reflected in the soldiers under their command. Not all troops were given such attention by their makers, of course, and there were legions of tech thralls on the Forged World without anything to differentiate them, but those who guarded the Fabricator General's own forged city were each handcrafted by one of his sworn adepts. Each warrior was an experiment as much as an instrument of war, gifted with a unique combination of enhancements chosen at whim amongst an infinity of possibilities. Some had their arms replaced by melee weapons, crackling with energy even in standby, while others carried massive cannons that drew their power from their wielder's own sustaining systems, shortening his existence with each devastating blast. Most had metal plates covered in sensory apparatus instead of faces, but one of them wore a mask of gold in the shape of a handsome human visage. All of them had, deep within their bodies, a small device that recorded their every deed, to be collected upon their demise so that their battle efficiency could be examined and the augmentations of those that performed the best replicated on the next batch. It took 1,393 seconds more for the group to reach Hangar 78. Located on the 216th level of Illuria, Only 5 levels below the entrance to the Fabricator General's quarters and more than 12 kilometers above the planet's surface, the hangar was little more than an open space with a landing pad. Its heavily reinforced doors had already begun the long process of opening when Omicron arrived. The transport, Omicron absently noted that, despite the fact that the vessel the envoys had arrived in was no Astartes ship, this aircraft was clearly one of the Legion's gunships, landed mere minutes after. At a command from the Heretic, the Skitarii formed 2 straight lines on each side of the landing pad and stood at attention. With a hiss of pressured air, the transport opened, and 2 silhouettes emerged from the darkness. When the true nature of the Astartes envoy became apparent to Omicron 193, the Heretic felt a rush of emotions, a mix of awe, fear and wonder. In that moment, he understood that there was much that could be gained from the alliance the envoys had suggested, not just the might to secure the Fabricator General's authority, but also lore and expertise that would elevate them all in their quest for knowledge. As he emerged from the rear hatch of one of the 2 Thunderhawks that had been attributed to his ship, the Crystalline, Paranepha felt rather than saw the emotions of the Dark Mechanicum priest and Skitarii come to greet him. Their faces were replaced by masks of metal or fusions of flesh and machine that left them little in the way of expressions, but even with his psychic sense stunted by his current situation, Paranepha could still feel their emotions, and still see the instinctive motions backward, minute as they were. They were in awe of his form, as well they should be. In the aftermath of the Battle of Asthena, Paranepha had been recovered by the warriors of the Forsaken Sons among the ruins of the once proud Hive City. Even with the protection his armor had afforded him, the human soldiers that had unleashed their wrath upon his prone form had horribly wounded him. By the time they had left him, convinced that they had killed him, they had very nearly been right. He had been on the very brink of death, only his psychic abilities and his transhuman endurance combined keeping him from oblivion. His brothers had saved him and brought him back aboard the Hand of Ruin, where the Fleshmasters had worked for days on stabilizing him. Then, once his wounds had no longer threatened his life, Archon had ordered him to be put into one of the dreadnought chassis the Warband had in its possession. Several of the hulking machines had been among the legionaries saved from the disaster at Terra by the Awakened One, but none of them had survived the trials of the Exodus. Heavy and slow, they had been easy praise for the quickest demonic hosts that had materialized on board, their ancient souls meals of choice for the Neverborn. But the suits had been recovered, and over time Mercurian had repaired them and even upgraded them. Based on a Mark IV dreadnought suit, there was no imperial classification for the type of dreadnought Paranepha had become, though the Techno-Adept had proudly called it the Pharisee Infernus model. From a sorcerer, he had become a walking tank, armed with a twin-linked las cannon on his right arm and a power gauntlet combined with a flamer on the left. His psychic powers had much diminished in his interment, the loss of most sensations had dimmed his connection to the warp. He could no longer cast the complex sorceries and rituals that had once been his to wield. All he could do was establish telepathic communions and channel what little power he could still access into the mechanisms of his metallic body. That had proven devastating in the slaughter pits of the Hand of Ruin, but Paranepha's new aspect remained untested by real combat. After he had become used to his new condition, Paranepha had expected to be punished for his failure, to be humbled by the Awakened One in full view of his brothers and made to fight as an engine of war in service to the Warband. But there had been no chastisement when he had stood before the Chaos Lord in his new mechanical form. Instead, Archon had granted him command of the Crystalline, a converted merchant frigate, and 20 Astartes, elevating him to one of his lieutenants, although the one with the less resources granted to him. The only hint of the warlord's displeasure had been a warning not to fail him, and Paranepha was certain he had given the same to every single one of his lieutenants before sending them on their own missions. The Awakened One had not shared his reasons to Paranepha, and they were the object of much speculation among the Crystalline's crew. But the former Thousand-Son legionary was far from a fool, even if his deceit by Serix Sithar had led many in the Warband to believe the opposite. He could guess. Though his manipulation by the Demon Prince had endangered Archon's life, it had also ultimately led to the completion of the anchoring and the success of the Warband's objective in Paraxis. The near-death and the humiliation the sorcerer had experienced at the hands of the human soldiers in Asthena was punishment enough. Now it fell to Paranepha to prove that he was worthy of the honor bestowed upon him. When the Crystalline had emerged from the wailing storm at the edge of the Iraset system, all aboard had been awed by what they had seen. Argenta Primus, recorded in stolen Imperial archives as a forged world of medium capacity, had become a hellforge of gargantuan proportions, with dozens of warships hovering in orbit. Its 3 moons had been gutted open, their mineral bounty exploited by endless streams of freighters that brought the ore to the planet below to feed its industry. "Now we know why Archon sent you here," Tenoch had remarked with dark humor. "It's a suicide mission." The former apothecary of the 12th Legion stood at his side as they left the transport. Tenoch had been assigned to his side by Archon himself, to monitor the health of the dreadnought's biological components. The Fleshmaster had quickly become Paranefa's unofficial second-in-command, maintaining discipline aboard the small ship with an iron fist. Unlike the greater vessels of the Forsaken Sun's fleet, the crew of the Crystalline couldn't allow the turf wars and cult conflicts that raged in the depths of the Hand of Ruin. They couldn't afford the loss in crew. At first, such control in a son of Angron had surprised Paranefa, for he had not been close to Tenoch prior to his entombment. But Tenoch had dedicated much of his research as a Fleshmaster to finding a way to limit the impact of the butcher's nails on his mental faculties, at least outside of battle. Through a combination of mental training, adrenaline suppressors, and several demonic pacts, the former World Eater had managed to establish a level of self-control rarely seen in the 12th Legion. "Our mission here isn't doomed to failure," Paranefa had answered, his mechanical voice surprisingly similar to his mortal one, a little challenge Mercurian had taken on himself. "Whether there are 3 ships or 100 in orbit of that world makes no difference, given the weapons at our disposal. This is a diplomatic endeavor, Tenoch. We have to convince whoever is in charge here that an alliance with us is more profitable than war. At least with what we have, they are less likely to immediately classify us as a threat and blast us to pieces." Tenoch had merely grunted in reply, leaving unspoken the fact that with only the Crystalline, there wasn't much to convince the Mechanicum priests that declaring war wasn't a bad idea. But he had said nothing more as Paranefa sent the message, using identification codes dating back to the Great Crusade. Then, he had followed the son of Magnus on the planet, and now that the two of them saw the reaction of the corrupted cybernetic warriors, the dreadnought could sense that some of the doubts of the Fleshmaster had been lifted. "Greetings, Margus," said Paranefa, addressing the only one among the welcome party that wasn't obviously clad in a panoply of war. "I am Paranefa, once a son of the 15th Legion, now a warrior of the Forsaken Sun's Warband. This is Tenoch, my advisor." "Greetings, Exalted One," replied the Dark Margus, bowing deeply, with a nimbleness that surprised the Infernus dreadnought. "I am Omicron 193, fourth of that name, servant of Arch-Heretic Elveros Anestes, Fabricator General of Argenta Primus. He bids you welcome to his world, and awaits your arrival to his personal quarters." "Then let us be on our way. I have seen many wonders in your city during the flight, and I am eager to meet the master of such a realm." "Of course. Please follow me." They did as the heretic asked, the Skitarii forming ranks on each side of the trio formed by the Tech Priest, Fleshmaster, and Dreadnought. They marched in relative silence, the Forsaken Sons taking in the vistas around them, the heretic doubtlessly considering the myriad ways in which the arrival of the Warband's envoys would change things on the Forged World. Then, Paranefa asked, "When we arrived in the system, we saw a great fleet in orbit, yet no sign of traffic at the system's edge. Why have the Archmagi of this world launched a campaign of conquest against the neighboring systems? Surely you do not lack the resources, nor the will, to do so." It was difficult to read the expression of the Dark Margus, only the left half of his face remained made of flesh, and even that was covered by his hood, but Paranefa sensed that his question had made the heretic uneasy. Finally, after several seconds of awkward silence, Omicron replied, "It has ever been the intent of Argenta Primus Fabricator General that we should expand our empire to other worlds." However, before Omicron could finish his sentence, something happened. They all felt it, Astartes and Heretic constructs alike. There was a shift in the world's very essence, a psychic transmutation of such suddenness and import that even non-psychers could detect it. Next to the psychic change came the sound, a wave of turmoil that reached the hangar and hit the warriors gathered there with physical force. Paranefa also detected the change through his dreadnought's sensors, a signal, covered in scrap code and dark mechanicum corruption, that was spreading across the entirety of the planet, activating protocols that had laid dormant within the cogitators of millions of constructs. The Skitarii reacted first, though not in the fashion Paranefa would have expected. They started screaming and twisting, clawing at their faces with whatever appendages they possessed. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they froze mid-motion. The dreadnought's weakened psychic sense was hit by wave after wave of mental agony as the Skitarii fought against the scrap code's intrusion in their systems. Then, all at once, it stopped. The Skitarii assumed their original positions once more, but with their weapons aimed at the Forsaken Sun's envoys. Tenoch was the first to strike. His nails, whose bite had been growing increasingly painful ever since they had set foot on the planet, suddenly surged with a flow of agony that commanded him to kill. His will, trained for years to resist and channel the rage of his implants, was overwhelmed and a veil of crimson fell on his eyes. Before the Fleshmaster realized what he was doing, his power axe was embedded in the cybernetic skull of one of the Skitarii, his bolt pistol barking at another, the shells breaking through the armor and spilling cybernetic guts. The corpse hadn't hit the ground that already Tenoch was in motion again, his training allowing his mind to catch up to his instincts. The former World Eater plunged at another Skitarii, his axe in motion again. He hacked and fired, never stopping in his motion, even when his attack failed to kill the target. Exposed, with no cover, Tenoch had to keep moving. Even the smallest pause would allow the Skitarii's targeting systems to lock on him, and then his armor wouldn't protect him for very long. Paranefa didn't need to avoid being hit, however, not that he could have, dreadnoughts not being exactly nimble. The Skitarii's fire ricocheted on his armor, failing to penetrate the adamantium plates, and he reacted by bathing 4 of the corrupted constructs in a wave of burning promethium from his flamer. Some of his psychic power flowed through the weapon, turning the flames a bright blue and granting them the same soul-devouring quality possessed by the demons of the Changer of Ways. Despite whatever had happened to their minds, the augmented soldiers screamed in agony as the fire consumed all that they were and reduced their bodies to melted slag. At the same time he used his flamer, Paranefa let loose a shot from his las cannon. At almost point-blank range, the shot melted a Skitarii's hips, and the upper and lower halves of his body fell to the ground separately, their systems overheated by the mere brush of the shot. The soldier didn't even have time to scream before his brain boiled within his skull. Paranefa rotated his upper body on its central axis, and brought his flamer to bear on the other rank of Skitarii. One of them, whose arms had been replaced with 2 crackling blades, charged him even as the warp-infused flames consumed his comrades. With a thought, the dreadnought stopped the flow of promethium and caught the Skitarii with his power fist, crushing it with the barest effort of his will and tossing the broken remnants away. And then it was over. Barely a few seconds after Tenoch's initial strike, 20 Dark Mechanicum Skitarii were lying on the floor, dead or dying. Such a result would have been a source of pride for Paranefa if he had not known that there were millions more on the planet. What treachery is this? Boomed the dreadnought, his las cannon aimed straight at the stricken heretic. The only thing preventing him from obliterating Omicron immediately was the fact that the Dark Magus was lying on the ground, leaking oil and blood from a wound the dreadnought was quite certain hadn't been inflicted by himself or Tenoch. "Not mine!" shrieked Omicron 193. "And not my master's, either. This is Haenorius' doing, may the rot take his circuits. We knew he was going to make his move soon, but I didn't expect the accursed spawn of a rusted servitor to attack you." "Explain yourself," demanded Paranefa, his weapon still pointed at the heretic. Omicron did just that. He told the Forsaken Sons of Tevri's Haenorius, the arch-heretic second in power only to the Fabricator General, and of his quest to supplant his overlord. He explained how the Fabricator General had hoped that the arrival of the Astartes would stay his rival's hand long enough to secure an alliance that would force any would-be usurpers to reconsider their plans. "If this is a coup," asked Tenoch when the heretic, still bleeding black oil and tainted blood, had finished, "then why did they attack us?" He concluded, gesturing to the dead Skitarii. "Weren't those supposed to be on your side? I didn't think the Mechanicum's metal soldiers could turn against their masters." "A day to infection," said Omicron, his tone halfway between disgust and awe. "Haenorius must have found a way to forcefully take control of their augmetics, and through them of their remaining flesh. He has perverted the phylactic communion protocols into slavery. We allow them little individuality to begin with. It wouldn't surprise me if only my colleagues Magus were still in control of themselves in this entire city." Paranefa considered the heretic's words, remembered the transmission he had felt just before the attack and lowered his las cannon, acknowledging the truth of the wounded Margus. As soon as he was no longer directly threatened, Omicron forced himself to his feet, and wobbled in the direction of one of the dying Skitarii. "What are you?" Tenoch began to ask, before suddenly stopping. Paranefa had little doubt the Fleshmaster's jaw was hanging open behind his vox grill. Omicron's right hand, entirely augmetic, had transformed from a normal appendage into a gaping maw that bit deep into the dying Skitarii's chest. Immediately, the twitches of the cybernetic warrior increased, and a stream of purple energy coursed from his body to the claw, and then through it, to the heretic. By the time it was finished, the Skitarii was dead, his body registering to Paranefa's senses as cold as the grave, with no spark of life or power left within. But that power hadn't been wasted. When Omicron returned to his feet, he stood taller, his augmetic eye blazed with an inner light, and the wound on his chest had closed, the tear in the priest's robes the only sign it had ever been there. "That looks like a useful trick," noted Tenoch once his surprise had abated. "How does that work?" Omicron hesitated, clearly unwilling to give up his secrets. But the current situation overcame the heretic's innate resistance to share the knowledge of his forged world, and he said, "Every construct of Argenta Primus uses the same sacred energy, drawn from the Empyrean through the hallowed mechanism of the Great Device. While it powers our systems, it also grants many other abilities to those with the knowledge to direct it to their will." That was a useful trick, but it wasn't what the Forsaken Sons latched onto. "You drain actual motive energy from the warp?" asked Tenoch, incredulous. "That's impossible." The Magi of Argenta Primus sneer at the impossible, scoffed Omicron, before admitting, "It wasn't easy, of course, and many failed attempts were made before all the quirks were ironed out. According to the archives, many forges were lost to transdimensional incursions with the early versions of the Great Device." "Transdimensional incursions," muttered Tenoch under his breath, clearly marveling at the Magi's attempt to downplay the gravity of a demonic incursion by giving it a different name. "Bloody fools! Why did you resort to this?" asked Paranefa. "Our own warpsmiths and dark magi have used the warp to power their devices, but only for the most ethereal ones, or for special component in larger constructs. Even then, it requires a lot of sealing to ensure even the slightest safety. Why use it to power your entire industry?" Omicron hesitated before giving his reply, as if he did not wish to share that part of the Forged World's history. Finally, he said, "The exact details are unclear. But Argenta Primus depended on the importation of promethium for most of its activity. When the warp storm erupted, we were cut off from resupplying, and had to find new, alternative sources of power for our devices." It was so simple to say it like that, yet Paranefa could imagine the terrible truth hiding behind the words. Margus would have watched their devices fail, starved of energy. They would have been confronted with their own mortality as their own internal augments were similarly drained of power. He could all too easily imagine the terrible battles as the Margus and their minions warred for the last reserves of promethium, desperate to prolong their existence even a little longer before the end. During the heresy, there had even been rumors that, on Mars, warriors on both sides of the Civil War had drained their enemies of power to prolong their own existences. With such an environment, and the presence of the warp storm above influencing the Margus' every thought, it wasn't that surprising that someone would try to use the Empyrean as a source of energy, no matter the risks. Potential death later was always preferable to certain, immediate death. "This tower," he began. "I sensed something with my psychic sense at the top of it when we approached, and our Thunderhawk's scanners went mad when we directed them toward it. Is it the Great Device you speak of?" "It is," confirmed Omicron 193. "Control of the Great Device has ever been the mark of the Fabricator General's status. By controlling it, he controls the flow of divine energy throughout the entire planet and ensure that his followers will inevitably rise against him in order to be free of the threat of being cut off the grid," commented Tenoch, still shaking his head at the monumental folly of it all, before turning toward Paranefa and opening an encrypted vox link that even the heretics shouldn't be able to breach. "Can we please get out of here and leave these madmen to their civil war? Our gunship should still be in the hangar. We can always come back after this is settled, if you really want to." "Cowardice, Tenoch? Really?" Paranefa asked back, the sarcasm somehow evident in his simulated voice. "You know that's not my reason," growled the Fleshmaster, his 12th Legion's temper emerging at the mere suggestion that he was willing to run from a fight. These people are insane even by Dark Mechanicum standards. And besides, what are we supposed to do? There are only 2 of us, 20 if you count our warriors in orbit, which I am not sure can get down here without being shot to pieces, and no matter how strong you are, the battles here are going to involve tens of thousands of troops at least. There is nothing we can do except die for nothing, and I chose to follow Archon to avoid precisely that. I am not sure we can leave at all, brother. Let me see if I can contact Eric. All right, but be quick about it. This entire tower is soon going to be a battlefield, I smell it in the air. Inside the dreadnought's sarcophagus, the biological remnants of the sorcerer cut off the sensory feeds from the war machine's auspex, turning the full focus of his mind inward, to his 6th sense. Eric, Paranefa pulsed, reaching to the son of Horus he had left in command of the ship. There is a coup going on here. What is your situation? A collection of images came back through the link: fire, shattered metal, and the sound of humans and mutants screaming. Then, the pack leader managed to focus long enough to send a coherent reply. It is chaos, my lord. The Dark Mechanicum's ships are firing on each other, and the crystalline is being shot at by at least half a dozen battle stations. We are not going to be able to hold for long. Get down here, ordered the dreadnought. Abandon the ship. Abandon the ship? But, Paranefa. Do it. If we succeed here, her loss will be insignificant. If we do not, then even more so. Paranefa cut off the link before the pack leader could argue further, confident that given a choice between certain death in the void or likely death on the ground, the former son of Horus would choose the latter. His perceptions realigned with the feeds of his optical arrays, and he saw that both Tenoch and Omicron 193 were staring at him. Our ship is doomed, he explained. We will go to your master's aid, Margus, but I expect that we will compensate for our loss. Of course. Agreed the heretic, bowing low, his mind radiating relief. The Fabricator General will reward you handsomely for your help in this trying situation. And how are we supposed to do that? Asked Tenoch, his voice still bitter, but less so, learning that there was no escaping the planet had caused him to shift mental gears into a state of full battle readiness, where nothing mattered except accomplishing whatever objectives were assigned to him. Margus. Paranefa redirected his brother's question toward Omicron. What is your master's plan to defeat this rebellion? I cannot contact him, admitted the heretic. Haenorius is jamming every means of communication I have. But I know my master as well as any on this world, and I can guess what he will do. The Fabricator General will attempt to break Haenorius' hold on the phylactic controls, and reclaim dominion over his Skitarii legions. But even for one such as my lord, that will take time, and Haenorius is sure to take action to prevent it. So we continue on our path to your master, then, Paranefa summed up. Then we help defend him from the foe for as long as it takes. That's suicide, growled Tenoch. How many Skitarii are in that forge city alone? We will be overwhelmed. My master's domain is far from defenseless, despite Haenorius' treachery, Omicron interjected. Your aid might be just what is needed to ensure his ultimate victory. Remember, priest, that you are betting your own life on this as well, warned Paranefa. I will inform our brothers to meet with us on the platform beneath the device atop the forge city. That is, I assume, the entrance to the Fabricator General's quarters? Omicron 193 nodded, and Paranefa sent the information to the Forsaken Sons pack leader, sensing the fury of the warrior at the whole situation as he did so. Eric was too busy to formulate his thoughts in a proper reply, but the dreadnought was fairly sure the message had gotten across. Let us go, he said. Right now, time is running against us. Omicron guided the Forsaken Sons through the corridors of Argenta Primus, using passages known only to the highest-ranking servants of the Fabricator General to avoid running into more Skitarii. Advancing at full speed, it took them 20 minutes to reach a hidden elevator that delivered them to the Forge City's top floor, at the base of the Fabricator General's tower. After several minutes of their circular platform rising in the dark, an hole opened above them, and they emerged right before the entrance to the tower. The first thing Paranefa saw was the tower itself, or rather, the great device that crowned it. Had he still had one, the sight would doubtlessly have taken his breath away, for the source of Argenta Primus' power was wondrous and terrible, both to the human eye and to his psychic sight. Atop the tower was an immense circle of metal, from which rose spikes adorned with runes that glowed with dark power. Above that crown-like structure, a sphere made of constantly rotating circles hovered, and a core of pure crackling energy could be glimpsed between the patternless rotations. At irregular intervals, great arcs of crimson lightning descended from the skies and struck the device, making the energy core and the runes flare with a surge of power before fading back to their normal state as the power was sent into the tower itself and then cast across Argenta Primus network. Yet it was the immaterial aspect of the engine that was truly fascinating. Only through psychic vision could one realize the true nature of the great device. It wasn't a conduit, channeling the power of the Empyrean, and Paranefa realized he had been a fool to ever think that would be the case. The warp didn't give up anything without a fight. Instead, the device stole the power of the Sea of Souls, literally draining tiny motes of soul stuff from the warp. The very substance from which both the souls of the living and the Neverborn themselves were composed, harvested as a power source by the Dark Magi. Did the heretics even realize that this power was, for all intents and purposes, sentient? No wonder the planet had fallen into ruinous corruption and a cycle of civil war. Every construct on it was cursed by the very same thing that kept it alive. When Paranefa was finally able to tear his attention from the device into the field of battle, a scene of carnage awaited him. Hundreds of Skitarii corpses laid in pieces on the ground, torn to shreds by a host of demon engines that radiated fury, hatred, and a profound, dark sense of joy that burned at Paranefa's very soul with its ugly corruption. The son of Magnus had seen such engines deployed at the side of the traitor legions during the heresy, constructs of the Mechanicum allies of the rebellion, but never in quite the same display of number and variety as the one he now witnessed. Their only common point was their allegiance and the fact that the great device's stolen power coursed through all of them. Some were quadrupedal, others lashed out at the world around them with writhing tentacles that also dragged them along the floor. Weapons of all kinds were affixed to their bulky form, from plasma cannons to devices that fired the raw stuff of the Empyrean upon their hapless foes. Some fought only in close quarters, tearing corrupted constructs apart with tooth and claw, feasting on the flesh of their victims as well as their souls. Paranefa could hear the desperate cries of the dead Skitari's souls as they were torn from their flesh and iron and consumed by the demon engine's infernal hunger. Even the skies themselves were filled with destruction. Dozens of gunships and transports were approaching the platform, carrying hundreds more Skitarii, combat servitors, and other, unnameable constructs in their holds, only to be blasted apart by the cannons that bristled from the walls of the tower. Barely 1 in 10 managed to reach the platform and deliver its payload, but that still added dozens of cybernetic soldiers to the hordes coming out of the other 3 entry point. Such a waste, thought Paranefa as he looked upon the devastation and imagined the carnage these forces could have wrought against the slaves of the false emperor. He did not know which, if any, of the dark powers held Argenta Primus in its grasp, but at the moment, he strongly suspected either the Blood God or the Changer of Ways were responsible for the civil war unfolding before his mechanical eyes. The demon engines, the Calastilal, Omicron 193 had told him they were called, weren't fighting alone against the rebellious Skitarii. Amidst the devastation, smaller silhouettes clad in black fired upon the ever-advancing hordes from behind the cover of fallen mechanical beasts. To any mortal ears, the sound of their weapons would have been lost amidst the cacophony of battle, but Paranefa's sensors isolated them with ease. Bolt weapons. Uruk, Paranefa voxed, his systems automatically adjusting to the frequency used by his brother's battle plate. Even as he spoke, the dreadnought added his own fire to the carnage. There was no need to aim. The mass of Skitarii was such that any weapon aimed vaguely in their direction was guaranteed to it. "I see you made it down here." The reply of the pack leader was preceded by a deluge of profanity, several of which actually made what remained of Paranefa's body cringe. Clearly, Uruk was not amused by his leader's flippancy. When Paranefa heard why, however, his own humor quickly soured as well. "The crystalline is dead, Paranefa," spat Uruk. "Blasted to pieces by the dark Mechanicum ships. Only half of my pack made it to the deck before we were forced to leave. I hate leaving brothers behind like that." "So do I," growled the dreadnought in response, unleashing a stream of warp fire as he did so. "Did you have any difficulty with the air defenses or the demon engines?" "None, surprisingly. It seems that someone thinks we are on their side, and is doing their best to keep us from being killed by our allies." The fabricator general, Tenoch supposed from behind Paranefa's bulk, calmly reloading his bolter, Omicron's trembling form at his side. Even if our little friend here couldn't reach him, he must have been ready to bet that we would help him. Even as he kept firing his last cannon at the Skitarii on the platform's edge and unleashing streams of sorcerous flame at those who managed to get near him, Paranefa marveled at the level of control the Fabricator General had on the Calastalal. To keep so many demon engines from attacking a very specific group of individuals, even as battle raged on around them, spoke not only of considerable willpower and technomantic lore, but of a very powerful influence in the warp as well. Elvira's Anestes would be a powerful ally indeed, and one the Forsaken Sons would need to watch closely. Omicron, said Paranefa aloud, his vox speakers booming his words loudly enough that they could be heard over the din of battle. Try to reach the Fabricator General. I want to know if he has a plan to solve this situation that doesn't involve us killing every single Skitarii and other battle construct in this city. After receiving confirmation from Tenoch that he and the heretic had left from behind him to another, more secure location, the dreadnought directed his full attention toward the battle. New waves of Skitarii were arriving, marching over the bodies of their fallen comrades as they were driven to advance toward the tower. For the Forsaken Sons, he shouted, and charged straight toward the closest pack of Skitarii. Perhaps drawn by his soulfire, his warcry, or spurred by an invisible command, 3 demon engines abandoned their bloody feasts to rush alongside him, like a pack of bears following their tamer to battle. As they charged, Paranefa let loose a volley of las fire from his cannon. Despite the targeting algorithms Mercurian had put in his systems, the dreadnought wasn't expecting to actually hit the Skitarii. The beam of his weapon was too focused for a moving shot. Usually, the Mechanicum's soldiers would have been able to predict Paranefa's attack and move out of the shot's path. But to his surprise, the crimson beam cut right through the squad, the Skitarii's risk assessment abilities clearly weakened by the scrap code that had overtaken their minds. 3 cybernetic warriors were cut to pieces, and then the dreadnought and the demon engines crashed amidst the survivors. The Skitarii died in mere seconds, their fire failing to penetrate the armor of their foes. Paranefa reveled in the destruction, relishing the brute strength of his iron body. In the fire of battle, the embers of his diminished soul flared brighter, enabling him to feel the world around him in a way non-psychers would never know. Through the dying thoughts of the Skitarii, the resonance of his gauntlet's machine spirit and the empiric power animating the soldiers, he could perceive the battle in its every detail, anchoring his mind into the now rather than wandering back to past battles. When he had awoken in his sarcophagus and realized what had happened to him, he had known a moment of complete panic, fearing the weakening of his mind and the warping of flesh and metal that would follow. Back when he had been a sorcerer, the Coven had foreseen that a terrible degeneration awaited the dreadnoughts of T9 legions who failed to maintain their sense of self throughout a life spent in the Eye of Terror. The creatures they would become, Hell Brutes, the name had echoed through Paranefa's mind during their sessions, were pitiful, broken and mad things, and the Forsaken Son refused to even consider such a fate for himself. Through his psychic sense, he could maintain his willpower eternally, and shield himself from the Dark God's malevolence. By battle and will, he would endure, and grow strong and high in the favor of the ruinous powers. He would remain a lord of war, not a berserk instrument of destruction that needed to be shackled and contained between battles. Perhaps that was another reason Archon had elevated him to one of his lieutenants. Paranefa was far more useful as he was now than as a screaming husk of metal and wasted flesh. Paranefa's sensors registered the approach of another group of enemy, and he turned to face this new threat. Far taller than the rest of the attackers, taller even than the Forsaken Sons, if not as tall as Paranefa's own metallic form. These troops weren't Skitarii, for there was nothing human inside them. Instead, they were perversions of the battle automata the Dreadnought had seen in action during the Great Crusade, robots enslaved to the Legio Cybernetica to serve in war. The 5 engines advancing on the Dreadnought and his feral cohorts appeared to have originated from the Castellax pattern, but like everything else on Argenta Primus, they had been greatly changed by the Magus' new allegiance. 2.5 meters high and black as the void beyond the galaxy, the corrupted robots were amalgamations of flesh and iron, staring at Paranefa with bulging eyes and glowing sensors. Their weaponized arms had been replaced with 2 writhing nests of tentacles, some cybernetic and others made of flesh, which flailed madly before them as they advanced. Pulsing cables and veins could be seen in the interstices of their armor, and the blank faceplate that should have crowned their humanoid shape reflected mad, ever-changing visions of the warp that would have driven a mere mortal insane. The biggest difference between these creations of the Dark Mechanicum and the automatons Paranefa had met during the Great Crusade, however, was the cold, soulless sentience he could detect within them. There was a forbidden artificial awareness, hideously mixed with the emotions of 100 minor demons parasiting each war machine. Even after everything he had witnessed and done, Paranefa couldn't help but be repelled by the notion. Demons were one thing, but abominable intelligences were another, altogether fouler kind of monstrosity, and these things, with the power of the great device coursing through them, were an unholy union of both. Artificial minds possessed by never-born spirits, clad in engines of war, potent instruments, yes, but also unreliable ones. Then again, thought the dreadnought as he brought his last cannon to bear and fired it, I guess a lot of the forces in the Warband fit that description. The blast stopped the first demonic robot in its tracks, sending it to the ground in a chorus of data shrieks. Its four kindred continued their advance, stepping around their defeated comrade. It was only then that Paranefa realized that the three machines of the Calastilal were still several meters behind him, feasting on the flesh, iron and souls of their last victims instead of coming to his aid. He just had time to curse the demon engines before the first battle automata reached him and he had to start to fight for his life. His power gauntlet grabbed one of the robot's helm and crushed it to pieces, causing the spirits imprisoned within to howl as they were released. At the same time, the tendrils of his attackers lashed back at him, and Paranefa screamed as he felt them bit through his armor and into the circuits laying beneath, where they spilled their technological poison. His vision swam as the dreadnought's systems tried to fight off the sudden intrusion of hostile code, just as he struggled to free himself from the tentacles. His mind translated the intrusion as pain, but Paranefa was used to pain, and he suppressed it. He gathered his will, and bathed one of the two remaining automatas in blue fire, while tearing his last cannon free and laying it to rest against the other robot's chest. At point-blank range, the weapon's discharge bisected the robot, and its upper half fell to the ground, its mass tearing its tendrils free of the dreadnought. But the construct upon which Paranefa had directed his flamer was still upright, seemingly unhindered by the warp fire flickering on its entire body. Its tentacles dug deeper into Paranefa's body, and he felt a twinge of concern as they drew nearer to the inside of his sarcophagus. His arm was entangled by the tentacles, his power gauntlet useless. He couldn't turn to use his last cannon. Paranefa called upon his psychic power, quickening his mind and slowing the passage of time as he searched for a way to escape this quandary. His sixth sense scoured the platform, and fell upon the tower at its center once more. This time, however, something within the building reacted to his desperate scrutiny. Within his mind, Paranefa saw the image of a giant burning eye staring at him, and felt the ancient pride and malice it contained. To his surprise, the entity attempted communication, sending images and emotions his trained mind quickly translated into words. It was an offer of mutual aid, coming from the Fabricator General himself. Through a combination of psychic power, secret knowledge and the mechanisms of the great device, the great heretic had found a way to reclaim control of his forces, but he required the dreadnought's help as a living focus, existing both in the realm of the machine and of the soul. Paranefa wasn't exactly in a situation to refuse, and signaled his accord with a pulse of psychic agreement. Immediately, the flow of time returned to its normal rate, and arcs of lightning flared from the great device, running down the tower before leaping through the air and slamming into the dreadnought. Paranefa screamed as his mind and that of Dark Arch-Heretic were united in the most brutal of manners, his psychic gift used as a vector for the raw, unfiltered power of the great device. At the common command of both Dreadnought and Fabricator General, the energy coursed through the tenuous links Paranefa's sixth sense could establish with the controlled Skitarii. Black light poured from him in a raging swirl, turning the last battle automata to slag before rushing toward the cybernetic warriors. Paranefa heard their cries of relief and agony as the sorcery imbued within the energy freed them from Haenorius' abnormal control. Then everything went dark, and he was confined to his sarcophagus as his overloaded systems rebooted and his psychic gift recovered from the ordeal. When his awareness of his surroundings returned to him, his chronometer indicated that a few minutes had passed. Skitarii were pulling the bodies of their dead brethren into shuttles while staying away from the feasting Calastilal, and the Forsaken Sons were conferring with a cybernetic warrior in particularly ornate armor and with a runic blade hanging at his hip. "I have control again," declared the Skitarii leader, and Paranefa recognized the intonation as that of the voice he had heard when the Fabricator General had established contact. "You have my thanks, emissaries. Now I can move against the rebellious arch-heretic and his cohorts." "You sound remarkably sanguine about all of this," remarked Tenoch, shaking his chain axe free of the gobbets of meat and circuitry lodged between the weapon's teeth. "I would have expected you to be a bit more angry. This has been the way of things on Argenta Primus ever since the first heretic Fabricator General succeeded in defeating the remnants of the Adeptus Mechanicus," the construct explained, its voice impossibly echoing on the open platform. "Always one of the Archmagi turns against his master, trying to usurp his rank. I myself came to my position in this manner. It is something close to a tradition." 12 of our brothers are dead because of your traditions," growled Eric. The head of the controlled Skitarii turned in his direction. "I am aware of your battle brother's demise. It was not my intent to imply that mercy should be shown to arch-heretic Haenorius because his actions were predictable. In fact, just as it is traditional for Archmagi to rebel against the holder of the tier, it is also expected for failed rebellions to be met with extreme prejudice." Eric's aggressive posture slackened just a little at these words. Before any of the other renegade Astartes could say anything, Paranefa stepped forward, all eyes turning to him at his sudden awakening, and said, "Fabricator General, me and my brothers would greatly appreciate to join your forces in this punitive strike." "I have full control of my Skitarii legions," replied the Fabricator General's puppet. "Your assistance, while welcome, is unrequired. As you said, you have already lost much in this venture, even yourself have taken damage, Lord Paranefa. Why would you expose yourself to more risk? Believe me, I already intend to repay the debt I owe you for your aid. There is more to this than simple calculations, Lord Elveros. This is about revenge. Haenorius is responsible for the death of 12 warriors of the Forsaken Sons, legionaries who had survived the Great Crusade, the heresy, and countless more horrors. We will make him pay for that, and we will do so ourselves." The dreadnought's bulky form hunched forward before Paranefa continued. "Understand this, for I believe it will be very important to our alliance's future. We are not helping you take down Haenorius. You are helping us take revenge on a common enemy." Tevries Haenorius stared at the hololithic display in front of him with 9 augmetic eyes. He could have had the data be projected directly on his vision, but over the centuries of his existence, he had found that he was better able to perceive the flow of battle through hololithic projections than through pure data transmission. The arch-heretic and fabricator of Ultio Maxima cut an imposing figure. 3 meters high, a deep hood of black leather made from the flayed skin of the disciples that had failed him hid his features and covered his chest, going down to the floor of the center of command. A single green light burned within the darkness of his hood, staring at the universe with unblinking focus. Each of Haenorius' flesh arms had long been replaced with augmetics, and over the course of his life, these replacements had been improved upon, becoming terrible weapons of war, capable of gutting a tank with a single shot. The power of the great device was strong within him, harvested and carefully hoarded over decades in the hope of finally gaining independence from Illuria's master. Haenorius was old, even as the heretics of Argenta Primus measured such things. In fact, he was possibly the oldest construct on the entire planet, and certainly held that title among the current fabricators. Even the current Fabricator General, the despised Elveros, had come into weakling, disgusting flesh existence centuries after Haenorius had shed the last portion of his humanity. He remembered the Forge world as it had been before the coming of the Warp Storm, had lived through the energy wars and the construction of the Great Device, and survived every Fabricator General since. And the 3-dimensional picture of the hololith indicated him that, unless he got really creative really quickly, that long life would soon come to an abrupt and violent end. That was, of course, if Elveros granted him death at all. A long and agonizing existence as a pain-filled wreck was still on the table if he was captured with enough of his systems intact. But he could accept that. He had made his move, knowing full well what he risked if he failed. What truly galled him was that his plan had been perfect, and that the only reason Elveros still lived was an outside intervention. And not any outside intervention, that of Astartes. Haenorius hated the Space Marines, loyal to the false Omnissiah or otherwise, with a passion that was at odds with his percentage of remaining flesh. During the Great Crusade, Haenorius had been counted among the ranks of the Myrmidons, these tech priests who dedicated themselves solely to the arts of war and destruction. He had fought alongside the forces of the Machine Empire on a dozen worlds, spreading death and desolation upon the enemies of the cult. During these wars, he had met the Space Marines several times. Like him, they were shaped for war, but while his own transformation had been the result of precise study and deliberate augmentation, none of the Astartes had had any choice in becoming what they were. They were children given the strength of demigods and cast into the stars by the Emperor, that they might claim them in his name. Many of them had been taken by force and transformed into Space Marines, and even those who hadn't couldn't be said to have made an actual, informed choice. They had been children, rarely more than a decade old. How could they possibly have known what awaited them? Yet Honorius felt no pity for these creatures. Instead, he felt hatred, for while he had been forced to work for decades, centuries even, to shape his physical frame into an instrument of war, earning every augmentation with blood and toil, the Space Marines had been given their power. Given. Power should not be given, it should be earned. Was it truly any surprise that these spoiled children had rebelled against their master, with such a shaky foundation to their loyalty? And yet the fate of the galaxy had been in their hands. When the War Master had turned, Honorius had seen it as the proof that his misgivings about the Space Marine legions had been correct. He didn't think that those among the Mechanicum who had sided with Horus were wrong to do so. They had their own philosophies, conflicting with those of the Imperium as it stood. War was inevitable, and through it the victor would prove itself superior, and therefore right. He had believed, after careful analysis of the legion's loyal and traitor, that Horus would fail, and thus had thrown his weight behind the Emperor. In the same way, when Argenta Primus had been engulfed by the warp storm and cut off from its supply of promethium, Honorius had sided with the faction whom he had believed would emerge triumphant. The choice had been far more obvious than during the heresy. Those who did not embrace the ways of the Eightfold Omnissiah would soon be starved of power and die. Survival was the first and greatest measure of strength, after all. And the idea that he was about to be proven weak by Astartes made him burn with rage. Besides making him move early, they had also been the reason his plan, decades long in the making, had failed. The last thing he had been able to perceive through the phylactic communion from the forces assailing the fabricated general's tower had been the unleashing of Empyrean energy by the dreadnought. Now the legions of Elveros and Estus were marching on his forge, and he knew his own servants would be plotting their defection if they had any kind of free will left. With Elveros in command of his forces again, the other fabricators of Argenta Primus had sent their own armies to Ultio Maxima, eager to prove their renewed loyalty to the fabricated general. With the fortifications of his domain, Honorius might have been able to hold the legions of Elveros at bay, at least until his reserves of energy ran dry, but the added weight of the other fabricators' forces would crush his walls with ease. He had sent many of his personal forces across the rest of the Forge world to aid in his coup, but with his loss of the phylactic communion network, these had either been slaughtered or were desperately fighting for their lives, too far to come to his aid. All told, the forces remaining in Ultio Maxima were less than a fifth of what he had originally possessed. To add insult to injury, the Astartes were part of the host advancing from Illyria. They even seemed to be in charge of the army. Would Elveros stop at nothing to humiliate him further? Honorius' bitterness was just as strong as his anger. He would fight until the end. He would use every weapon in his arsenals, every trick accumulated over his long existence. The Astartes and Elveros minions would pay a price of blood and oil for every street of his forge they took from him. And when they reached him, he would go down fighting, and force them to kill him rather than capture him and deliver him in chains to the fabricated general. And after that, defeat was inevitable. But he would make his enemies pay a price for their victory so high that they would remember him for the rest of their lives. Turning his attention away from the hololith, Honorius sent his mind across the myriad cables that linked him to the rest of the forge, deep into the bowels of the city. There, buried below hundreds of meters of metal and stone, lay the burning heart of Ultio Maxima, a receptacle of Empyrean power of tremendous capacity. Even though his physical body was kilometers away from it, merely interacting with it in this fashion caused the power running through the arch-heretic system to react. Slowly, carefully, Honorius began to undo the hexagrammatic seals on the core. Ultio Maxima was a city that permanently teetered on the brink of utter destruction. It had been built on the edge of a gigantic tear in the surface of the world, said to have been caused by an early version of the Great Device detonating. Over the years, It had spread above the yawning abyss, supported by pillars of plasteel and other, less recognizable materials. Now the conglomerate of forge temples, warehouses and laboratories reached from one side of the infernal chasm to the other. Massive anti-grav generators had been placed on the forge's bottom, keeping its massive weight from overwhelming its supports. The armies loyal to the Fabricator General approached the forge from the two sides of the chasm, but the Forsaken Sons were only present in one. Paranefer, Tenoch, and the surviving members of Verex's pack had been granted the right to lead the assault by Elveros. Tens of thousands of Skitarii and their war machines marched in the column in perfect formation, despite the fact that they had been rampaging across Illyria mere hours ago. The speed at which Elveros had organized his riposte was truly impressive, and only possible because of the Fabricator General's absolute control over his minions. There were warsmiths of the 4th Legion that would have felt envy at such a quick and efficient deployment. At Paranefer's demand, Elveros commanded the other army to cease their advance on the Forge City, instead establishing a cordon to catch any attempts to flee the city from their side of the chasm. Only the force led by the emissaries would set foot within Altio Maxima, and the life of its treacherous arch-heretic belonged to the Forsaken Sons. The first wave of attack came in a rain of shells and energy fire from the besiegers' heavy armor. Engines ranging in size from Chimera tanks to Warden-Atus-class artillery pieces unleashed a terrible bombardment upon the Forge City's walls. The defenses of Altio Maxima replied in kind, destroying many war machines before the overwhelming numbers of the attackers prevailed. It took 3 hours for the batteries of the gorge's eastern side to finally fall silent. By that time, the mighty outer wall had been reduced to a field of rubble passed by the shattered remnants of the gun defenses and their crews. On a silent command, the Skitarii legions began to advance, accompanied by the surviving tanks able to navigate over the debris. In the heart of every corrupted cyborg burned the urge for vengeance against Haenorius, whose schemes had turned them upon their masters, however temporarily. With blade, lasgun, and other, experimental weaponry they would purge Altio Maxima of all constructs that called the arch-heretic their lord. Resistance appeared within minutes of the first Skitarii clearing the rubble. Heretics and combat servitors rose from the ruins of their temples with the same eerie synchronization their enemies displayed. Dragged from their hiding places by the call of their master, they opened fire on the lines of Skitarii, and scores of the soldiers fell in the first seconds of this ambush. They responded quickly, however, and adapted their patterns of advance to the locations and tactics of their foe. Slowly, inexorably, Elveros' armies marched on, grinding the opposition to dust. When the advance reached the districts spared from the initial bombardment, it splintered, with Skitarii Alphas leading their units to purge individual sub-temples. A sizable portion of the army, however, continued to march straight for the siege of power of the renegade Fabricator, at the center of the Forge City. Paranefer and the rest of the Forsaken Sons were among that group, and the dreadnought fought at the front, crushing and burning all who stood in his path. The son of Magnus was an adamantium-clad storm of destruction spearheading an army of thousands. His battle brothers fought at his side against the tide of twisted tech thralls and afflicted slaves Haenorius forced against them. The march to the central temple was accomplished on a carpet of broken flesh, and while the wretches couldn't possibly hope to stop the invaders, they slowed the advance down through the sheer force of inertia of so many bodies. Finally, as the sun of the Iroset system set behind toxic clouds, they reached the main Forge Temple. While less grandiose than the Fabricator General's sanctum, Haenorius' fortress was still magnificent in its own right. Pyramidal in shape, it was covered in arcane glyphs and depictions of mechanical patterns, carved in red lines over black stone. Statues of past heretics and demonic creatures stood upon it like gargoyles, watching the progress of the invaders with eyes that appeared to follow their motion. Though Elveros' spies had revealed the existence of hundreds of tunnels leading in the pyramid, there was only one entrance above ground, a pair of massive doors in the middle of the pyramid's southern side. The doors came crashing down when Paranefer rammed them at full speed, revealing dozens of Skitarii taking cover behind altars and pillars in a vast hall. At once, battle was joined, las fire tearing through the oil and blood-scented air. The Skitarii gathered here by Haenorius were clearly some of the best forces at the arch-heretic's command, temple guards, their flesh all but entirely stripped away and replaced by armor blackened in infernal fire and weaponry that crackled with barely restrained power. They died all the same, though it took longer and cost more Skitarii than any other battle so far. Hundreds of cybernetic soldiers poured through the broken gates, bringing their crushing numerical advantage to bear. After the last of the hall's defenders was slain, the Forsaken Sons and their dark Mechanicum allies pursued their advance deeper into the pyramid, toward Haenoria's command center. On their way, they encountered several barricades, guarded by sentry guns, heretics, and demon engines unleashed from their bones in a desperate attempt to push back the invaders. Many of the infernal contraptions had killed their handlers by the time the attackers reached them, but they still fought with fierce hatred, and 2 more of Eric's pack were slain, torn apart by the claws of some abomination looking like a 6-limbed minotaur of old myth. Finally, they reached the center of command, deep within the pyramid's core. Paranefa led the remaining Forsaken Sons and several squads of Scutari, while the rest completed the purge of the temple. There, standing at the center of the room, a hololithic projection of the burning Forge City floating before him, was Tevri's Haenorius. 24 heretics were scattered across the room, slaved to console panels and not reacting to the intrusion in the slightest. The dreadnought could only sense the barest flicker of sentience within their robes. They had been enslaved to Haenorius' data infection for so long that their souls had all but withered away. As for the arch-heretic himself, Paranefa had to admit that he looked the part. Almost as tall as the dreadnought on his own, the additional elevation of his position allowed him to tower above all those who had entered his domain. Power radiated from him in waves, cold and unforgiving, full of old hatreds and thwarted ambitions. No matter that the Forsaken Sons had just breached into his final sanctum, here was a Lord of Chaos, his back to the wall, ready to fight to the last. Paranefa could respect that, at least. Suddenly, an idea popped in his head. Arch-heretic Haenorius, boomed the dreadnought. You know who we are. I will make you this offer once, surrender, and you will live to serve the Forsaken Sons. You have proven that you would be a valuable asset to our warband, and I am sure the fabricated general would agree. Predictably, the rage Paranefa could feel from Haenorius increased, and he raised his arms, cables snapping free from his body at the motion. The dreadnought had known his offer would never be accepted, otherwise, he wouldn't have made it in the first place. Haenorius had to pay for the death of 14 warriors of the Forsaken Sons. There was no possible way Paranefa could let him live, even if he had really wanted to. What a shame, he said, mockingly. Then I will have your head. None of you misshapen gene freaks will leave this city alive, the arch-heretic spat back. You will all die here, one way or another. A hail of bolts and lass fire rained upon Haenorius, but a sphere of black lightning surrounded him, shielding the arch-heretic from the shots. Then he opened fire in turn, letting loose twin rays of energy from his arm cannons. The Forsaken Sons were already moving, and the beams hit the Scutari who stood behind them. Strangely, they had time to scream before they died. Paranefa wondered if the weapons had been deliberately calibrated for such an effect, and how many unfortunate subjects had been sacrificed in the adjustments. The dreadnought ran straight into the hololithic projector in the middle of the room, crushing it under his foot and reaching up toward Haenorius with his power gauntlet. The weapon's power field crackled as it encountered the force field surrounding the arch-heretic, and for a few seconds, Paranefa struggled against the resistance, until the combined fire of the Scutari and Forsaken Sons finally overwhelmed it and it shut off with a sound akin to the wailing of lost souls. Mere seconds later, the dreadnought's fist closed around the arch-heretic's lower body, crashing through the metal deck upon which he stood. With a triumphant roar, Paranefa rotated his upper half, tearing Haenorius from his perch and sending him flying across the room. The Dark Magus crashed into one of his enslaved servants in a shower of sparks, but despite his bulk, rose to his feet with surprising agility. But before he could bring his arm cannons to bear once more, Paranefa's power fist rammed into his chest and burst from his back in a spray of blood, oil, and shattered mechanical parts. For a few seconds, the two Lords of Chaos stared at each other, the arch-heretic's head at the same height as Paranefa's outward eyes. Then, a sound disturbingly similar to a chuckle emanated from Haenorius' vocalizer, and the light of his optics faded. Well, that was easy, declared Tenoch, the white and blue of his armor completely covered by the gore of his many victims. For someone who caused us so much trouble, he sure went down quickly. Paranefa ignored the mocking comments of his brother and tossed the corpse of Haenorius aside, scanning the room. He could feel that something was very, very wrong, but the floor suddenly shook violently, tossing Skitarii to the ground and tearing the few heretics who had survived the brief gunfight from their consoles. A horrible scream filled the mind of Paranefa, and from how his brothers were clutching their heads and howling on the Vox, he wasn't the only one affected. After a few seconds, the psychic scream abated, though it was still present at the edge of perception. The Skitarii looked around, and Paranefa detected their confusion. The link of phylactic communion had been broken, and they were left without the direction of the Fabricator General. He had more pressing concerns, however. Paranefa could sense the warp overcharging the air, the veil between reality and the Empyrean thinning to the point that it barely existed at all. Understanding dawned within his mind, and he called over the Vox, not just to his brothers, but to all forces within Altio Maxima. This is Paranefa of the Forsaken Sons. All forces, evacuate the city immediately. Haenorius has initiated a warp breach. He thought for a second, trying to remember how Omicron had described the phenomenon. Transdimensional incursion imminent. Everyone get out of here. He switched to a private channel, and called the Forsaken Sons to him as he began to move toward the room's exit, ready to crush any Skitarii who got in his way. As the remaining Astartes got in formation around him, however, the first signs of the demonic incursion began to manifest. The corpses of heretics strewn across the command center twitched, the warp-borne energy within their systems reacting to the demonic presence. Like puppets, they rose, optics burning with warp fire, flesh and metal rippling as horrid mutations spread over them. Uruk swore over the Vox as he fired toward the closest of the possessed heretics. It took 6 shots to bring the undead creature down, and then only after a bolt ripped its head apart. All the while, the former son of Horus was still running and keeping an eye on the Skitarii who had accompanied the Forsaken Sons. The cybernetic warriors were animated by the same energy that had opened the Dark Magi to possession, yet they appeared to be unaffected, and were evacuating as well. Doubtlessly there was some reason to that, perhaps the fact that their souls, wretched as they were, remained within their bodies made it more difficult for the warp to claim their physical shells. "I am getting reports from the rest of the army," said Tenoch as the group left the control center and began to fight its way through the pyramid once again. "This is happening across the entire Forge City." "Any reports of actual Neverborn?" asked another warrior as they neared the pyramid's entrance, surrounded on all sides by the reanimated fallen of both sides. "Not yet, but it's not going to last," replied the Fleshmaster grimly. For all that Tenoch enjoyed fighting, he, like all the Forsaken Sons who had been aboard the Hand of Ruin during the flight from Terra, knew just how dangerous fighting demons could really be. In the most advantageous circumstances, it was difficult enough, when the air was saturated by warp energy and there were thousands of potential hosts lying around. It was a nightmare. In the end, Tenoch's prediction came true 14 minutes later, when the Forsaken Sons and the Skitarii who had regained enough of their wits to stick to the group of transhuman warriors were halfway to the Forge City's borders. They had made quick progress, abandoning the careful advance of the invasion in favor of a disciplined but hasty retreat, and the possessed constructs, while difficult to kill, lacked the organization to gather in significant numbers and pose a true threat to the small warband. Then, instead of falling back to the ground, a reanimated heretic Ulrich had shot in the head burst apart, and a 12-limbed monstrosity of black goo and screaming faces emerged from the ruin. Paranefa burned the demon with his flamer, but from that point on, almost every risen corpse the group came across became a gateway to some manner of horror from the Sea of Souls. Of the 200 or so Dark Mechanicum Skitarii who had emerged from the pyramid at the Forsaken Sons' sides, only half still lived when they reached the rubble that had once marked the Forge City's outer wall. They had barely cleared out of the chasm when the supports of Altio Maxima finally broke and, with the sounds of metal tearing and the horrified cries of millions of souls suddenly realizing their inescapable doom, the entire Forge City tumbled down into the abyss, warp fire ravaging entire districts in an orgy of unchecked destruction. The Forsaken Sons and the Skitarii who had managed to escape looked in awe at the spectacular destruction Haenorius had unleashed in his final act of spite. Paranefa wasn't sure whether the Forge City would be entirely consumed by the warp or if it would reach all the way down the chasm, perhaps crashing into the planet's burning core. In the end, it mattered little. Victory had been claimed, though not without considerable cost in Skitarii lives. Far from all the forces Elveros and his loyal arch-heretics had sent had been able to clear out of the city in time. Fabricator General, Paranefa called over the long-range Vox link to Elveros. Haenorius has been dealt with. The ship hadn't had a name before, just a series of numbers. But upon taking command of her and making her his personal flagship, Paranefa had decided to baptize the Dark Mechanicum ship the Crystalline, in honor of the vessel they had lost during the orbital battle, and with more than a slight dose of dark humor. The new Crystalline had nothing in common with her namesake. More than 5 kilometers long, the Crystalline was a variant on the heavy cruisers of the Imperial Navy, bristling with weapons of all kinds. Like most of the fleet Helveros had given to the Astartes, she had fought under Haenorius' banner during the brief Void War, and the purge of the Dark Magi and Tech thralls faithful to the fallen Arch-Heretic was still ongoing in the ship's depths. The Scutari who had survived the purge of Ultio Maxima had taken to that particular duty with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. They were still fresh from their catastrophic losses in that city, and were eager to avenge themselves on any remaining servants of the Arch-Heretic responsible for the short-lived demonic incursion. As news of the rebel Arch-Heretic's death spread, those who had fought for him across the Forge world had either surrendered or fled. While the latter were still being dealt with, the former left Helveros with the question of what to do with them. Traditionally, such servants of the defeated side in the heretics' internecine conflicts were either executed or reprogrammed and integrated to the ranks of other arch-heretic followers. Instead, the Fabricator General had decided to grant almost all the assets owned by the dead Haenorius to the Forsaken Sons envoys, as thanks for their help, and as a clever way to ensure none of his remaining arch-heretic had the resources to challenge him anytime soon. Tenoch and the other Forsaken Sons had joined the carnage on the decks below, while Paranefa stood on the bridge, Omicron 193 sitting in the shipmaster's seat a few meters behind him. In the aftermath of the Battle of Ultio Maxima, Omicron had been elevated to the rank of Arch-Heretic himself by the Fabricator General, and appointed to the Forsaken Sons as ranking Magus of the Dark Mechanicum Heretics among the fleet. He was currently busy mentally coordinating the fleet's imminent departure, while Paranefa, whom the Fabricator General had very clearly confirmed to be in charge of the entire fleet, with Omicron being his subordinate, looked through the oculus at the gathering of vessels that was now his to command. It was a beautiful sight. Ships filled with gene mills and augmetic factories that could churn out thousands of Dark Mechanicum Scutari by the day, forge barges that could devour moons and build legions of twisted machines, and transports filled to the brim with the warriors of the defeated Arch-Heretic, kept slumbering until they would be awakened for war. Powerful warships, their cores pulsing with demonic light, hovered in a protective circle, their weapons a mix of technology Paranefa understood and Dark Mechanicum innovations he did not. With such a fleet, entire systems could be brought to their knees, yet the endless rebellions and purges had prevented the Lords of Argenta Primus from conquering the rest of the Wailing Storm. It would fall to the Forsaken Sons to use these resources instead. He would take the Armada across the Wailing Storm, seeking these worlds Archon had commanded him to bring under the rule of the Forsaken Sons. He would test it in battle, and learn its strengths and weaknesses, forge it as the Forsaken Sons had been forged. What had previously appeared to be a death sentence had suddenly become entirely feasible, for with the power of the Dark Mechanicum behind him, Paranefa greatly doubted there was anything in the entire warp storm that could threaten him. He wouldn't need to rely on diplomacy and instead would act as was fitting for an Astartes, as an unstoppable conqueror. Then, when his duty was complete, Paranefa would bring the fleet and all else that he had gained to Archon, a gift worthy of the Awakened One's stature. All among the Warband would know that the Dreadnought had earned his place as one of the Chaos Lord's seconds. Whether he remained in command of the fleet or not, the son of Magnus would be elevated above almost any other warrior by this success. Ensuring the loyalty of the heretics that crewed the Dark Mechanicum ships would take a long time, and no small amount of effort. For all that the Fabricator General had accepted the alliance with the Warband, the recent events proved beyond doubt just how strong his control of the priests of Argenta Primus really was. Paranefa doubted that all Dark Magi would survive the process, but it didn't concern him of much. Better to have one loyal servant than a dozen treacherous ones. This was the lesson the false emperor had learned far too late, as his empire burned around him and his dream of godhood fell to ruin. Of course, not all potential traitors would be found out. Treachery was endemic among those who marched under the banner of the ruinous powers, as Argenta Primus so perfectly illustrated. There would be heretics who would seek their own gain ahead of that of their lieges, who would plot against each other for secrets and to avenge past slights. Loyalty in the ranks the Forsaken Sons was only to Archon, and among those battle brothers who had fought together during the Exodus. But the great deceiver, the one who even now held Paranefa's soul in his clawed grasp, would not allow a true chain of command, like those which had existed in the days of the Great Crusade, to emerge in the Warband. Such was not the way of chaos, and those who tried to impose order upon its servants were doomed to failure. The Awakened One knew this, and only sought to ride the tides of the primordial truth, sailing the possible futures toward the one he desired. Paranefa had seen that future, when he laid upon the Fleshmaster's operating tables, before his psychic powers were stifled. Amidst the pain and the numbing chemicals pumped through his blood, he had caught a glimpse of the future the Awakened One and other warlords of his kind worked to make reality. He had seen the galaxy burning once more, the false emperor toppled, and the weak Imperium cast down, replaced by a realm of dreadful wonders, ruled over by those with the strength to direct mankind's course. It had been magnificent. And one day, vowed the infernal dreadnought as a fleet of dark Mechanicum vessels awaited his bidding, he would see it made true. Plus Imperial Record 6GR2E89E2GR4+. Plus System Etheric Plus. Plus World, Etheric 1, Hive World Plus. Plus Population, approximately 20 billion plus. Plus Notable Assets, genetic laboratories under the direction of Marcus Aristosis, Ref. Project 11456D3A8 Plus. Plus access to this report is reserved to those with a magenta level clearance and above. Plus the Emperor protects. Plus. He woke up with a start, as if he hadn't been sure he would ever wake again when he had lost consciousnus. Pain ran through his flesh in waves of agony, and his memories were a confused mess of images and sensations. A name emerged from that muck, Belarius. He assumed that was his own, though he didn't remember anything else with anything approaching clarity. A moan escaped his dry lips as he struggled to take stock of his situation. He was lying down on some hard surface, but something soft covered him, a blanket, perhaps? "Ah," said a voice nearby, warm and kind. "You are awake. Easy, my lord. Do not struggle. You have been sleeping for a long, long time." He turned his head, and saw an old, bearded man, clad in black robes and carrying a cup of water. His view of his surroundings also began to clear, revealing a small natural cavern, in which he would barely be able to stand up. Apart from the bed upon which he sat, there was another, smaller bedding, a bookshelf, and a table. The only source of light came from a lantern suspended on the wall, but it was bright enough to see clearly. There was only one exit out of the 5 or so meters large room, a tunnel on the opposite side from where he was sitting. "Drink, my lord," continued the old man, bringing the cup to the lips of the confused man, who just then realized how parched his throat was. He opened his mouth, and the cool, scented liquid flowed upon his tongue. The foul concoction tasted like rotten poison and blood as it was force-fed into his near-dead body, and down his throat, slaking his thirst. He felt his mind get clearer, and the pain in his limbs fade. He turned to sit on his bed, still feeling dizzy, and as he did so, he realized that the priest was much, much smaller than him. Yet it didn't seem to him that the priest was small, it was him that was huge, somehow. Should he stand up, he estimated that he would almost twice as tall as the man. "Just as the prophecy said," continued the priest, "you have awoken." "The prophecy?" croaked Belarius. "What are you talking about?" "A vision that came to one of my predecessors who watched over your sleeping form, my lord. It told him that a day would come when the lands of Etheric would need you, and you would rise from your slumber to bring back unity and peace to the shattered kingdoms. I feared that this time had come, and that you wouldn't awaken, but I see now that I was only lacking in faith." How long was I sleeping?" "I don't remember anything, except my name." "Your name?" The priest appeared surprised, then an odd expression formed on his face. Could you tell it to me, Lord? It has been so long that it has been forgotten." That was strange. They had passed on that prophecy about him down the generations, but they had forgotten his name? Wasn't that important as well? "Belarius. My name is Belarius. Now answer my questions. First, tell me, what is your name?" The priest smiled warmly and replied, "My name is Karalit, my lord." What followed were a few very enlightening hours for Belarius, as Karalit told him about the history of Etheric, for such was the name of the world upon which they all lived. The old man brought up ancient maps and paintings, and taught the newly awakened noble all that he would need to know in order to fulfill his destiny. In ages past, the gods had created etheric, and seeded life upon the world. In time, humans had appeared, and the gods had favored them as their children, bestowing many gifts upon them, such as singing, writing, and other talents. None of the gifts, however, had matched the sending of the lords, envoys of the gods charged to guide the growing human population through the trials of existence. These lords had been shaped in the forms of men and women, though all who looked upon them immediately knew their greatness and trusted in their will. Belarius had been one of these lords, born not from humans, but from the hands of the gods themselves. He had helped the people of Etheric achieve their full potential, ruling over one of the greatest cities of this golden age. But then, from beyond the reach of even the gods themselves, a dark and terrible threat had arrived, one that would have ended all life upon the entire planet, if not for Belarius' own heroic sacrifice in battle against it. Belarius had banished that evil, now only known as the Shadow, and restored peace across Etheric, but such had been the wounds he had endured in the battle that he had fallen into the coma from which he had just finally awoken. It annoyed and troubled Belarius that the exact details of his supposed sacrifice had also been forgotten, but Karalit had assured him that the evil he had fought was so dark and horrible, no mind had been able to bear knowledge of it long enough to pass it on. Yet in the end, despite his sacrifice, Etheric's age of glory had ended some 300 years ago, a mere few years after Belarius' fall. Some terrible, unknowable event had cut Etheric off the heavenly realm, and killed many of the lords and ladies of Etheric. Those of the noble lords who had survived, without the guidance of the gods, had fallen into insanity and turned against one another. They had dragged their kingdoms along with them, and a cold war had broken out between the realms. For 3 centuries this war had been consigned to skirmishes and the occasional open, prolonged conflict between 2 lords. Now, however, the darkness that had been massing in the heart of every lord and lady of Etheric had reached a boiling point. The 7 mightiest lords had each publicly denounced the others as heretics and traitors to the gods' will, responsible for their silence. They had all gathered their armies and marched to the place where, according to legend, the link between the gods and Etheric would be restored. They had come to the plain below Belarius' tomb, the field where he, the 8th of their number, had fallen in battle, 300 years ago. The minor lords had flocked here as well, drawn into the imminent conflict by webs of alliance and oaths of fealty to their betters. Already, what had been previously unthinkable, the death of several of the supposed immortal lords, had occurred, as tensions grew too high and armies clashed against one another, with their masters leading the way. Their people had been driven mad by their demise, and had scattered into the woods, wailing their sorrow in pitiful choirs of the lost. The 7 major lords, the sovereigns of Etheric, remained, their forces gathered around them, none willing to commit to battle against their rivals first. Still, it was inevitable that eventually one of them would move, and all the others would follow, and the plains would drown in blood once more, just as they had when Belarius had led his forces to war in the time before his long slumber. Karalit insisted that only Belarius could prevent an explosion of violence that would leave Etheric leaderless, which would promptly lead to anarchy and untold ruin. Belarius wasn't so certain. He certainly didn't feel like a savior. His body still hurt every time he moved, despite the restorative effects of whatever concoction Karalit had fed him. But the priest showed him the ancient scrolls, depicting a silhouette rising from the monument built to honor his sacrifice, holding a sword carved from a single piece of green metal and bringing peace once more across the world. Granted, the scrolls did not tell much about how he was supposed to do that, but the mere fact that he had risen from his slumber at the appointed time indicated that there was something to the prophecy. And the truth was, he had no choice, not really. Karalit did not say it out loud, but it was obvious when Belarius considered the situation. The armies were already gathered, and it was only a matter of time before one of their patrols found the cavern where Karalit and his predecessors had secretly cared for Belarius' body while the rest of the world slowly descended into madness. There was nowhere he could flee to, for the sovereigns held the entire planet in their grasp, and he wasn't exactly hard to notice. He would be noticed, and then what? Would he flee again? If he did not do something to end the madness of the sovereigns, then there was no telling what any of them would do if they captured him. Beyond the bare necessity of action, there were also moral considerations to take into account. Karalit painted a bleak picture of the world, where entire cities had fallen into ruin as their lord descended into madness and lost interest with the day-to-day management of his territories. Belarius' memories might be clouded, but the old priest had assured him that it would only be temporary, and he wanted to do what his old self would have done. So, after donning a suit of armor that had been religiously preserved and taking up his ancient but still sharp longsword, Belarius emerged from the cavern where he had slept for 300 years, and saw the world he was destined to save. He stood near the base of a mountain, but still high enough that he had a clear view of his surroundings for kilometers. He saw green forests and vast meadows, crossed by rivers of clear water. In the distance, he could see shining cities of white marble and stone, stinking marshes and fallen, burned trees, with mountains of shattered towers and ruined houses under a sky filled with toxic clouds through which shone baleful light. It was beautiful, and Belarius resolved that he would do all he could to help restore peace and order to this land. For he could also see the signs of war, columns of smoke rising above the camps where armies had gathered, patches of forest where the trees had been cut to feed the campfires, and flocks of raven flying over plains that he knew must be littered with corpses. Not too far away, he could see the monument that had been built on the site of his downfall, a towering obelisk, some 100 meters tall. According to Karalit, it was generally simply called the monument, though other names, such as Belarius' grave or the Pillar of Sacrifice, were also commonplace. At the foot of the structure were countless small dots, one of the armies gathered by the lords. Only one of the sovereigns would have the prestige to lay claim to Belarius' presumed tomb. In time, he would need to go there and confront whoever was in charge. But before that, there was something else he had to do. According to Karalit's last advice, to his eternal regrets, the old man was too frail to accompany him in his journey. His best choice of destination was the nearest forest, where the followers of the two dead lords had fled. After all, if he was to bring peace and order back to the land, where better to begin than with those who had lost everything? By his estimation of the sun's course in the clear sky, it took Belarius about an hour to reach the camp that the soldiers had improvised in the forest. There must have been hundreds of soldiers here. Some of them were gathered around campfires or under tents, while others were engaged in rites of mourning, tearing at their hair and weeping openly at the sky. The equipment of the soldiers varied greatly, from swords to axes to bows and slingshots. Scraps of old rags tightened around twisted bones and inflated muscle, scaled skin and elongated fangs. But all of them wore a strip of cloth around one of their arm, which was either purple or blue. As the soldiers saw Belarius, shouts of alarms rose, quickly turning to as they realized the nature of the newcomer. One of them approached him hesitantly, his hand going nervously to the hilt of the sword hanging at his hip, though he did not draw it. However, as soon as Belarius turned his eyes in his direction, the soldier froze in place, as if transfixed by the lord's appearance. "Tell me," asked Belarius, "to which of my two fallen brethren did the occupants of this camp owe their loyalty?" "Both," replied the man, looking up at Belarius' visage. "When our masters fell, we both came here to mourn them together, away from the other lords. I fought on Lord Dectarian's side," continued the soldier, gesturing toward the blue stripe on his right arm, "against Lady Maria Alice." That explained the stripes, at least. With the armies being composed of whatever subjects the lords could gather and bring with them to war, creation of proper uniforms had probably not been a priority, and these men had improvised another way to differentiate between their comrades and their foes in the heat of battle. Yet it also rose another question. "Your masters killed one another in battle," noted Belarius with incredulity, "and yet you are here together?" The man shrugged. There was a haunted look in his eyes as he explained. "We were enemies because our masters commanded it, sir. When they died, most of us just wanted to stop fighting. There was no reason to anymore. I loved my lord, make no mistake, but I wasn't blind to what was happening to him either. He wasn't right in the head at the end. The separation, it has done terrible things to some of your kindred." The separation. Karalit had told him that this was the name the common people of Etharic had given to the event that had killed most of the lords and cut off the survivors from the voice of the gods, eventually driving them into madness. No one knew what had caused this. The lords had struggled to continue their duty at first, but they had not been created for such circumstances, and the burden of leading their people had taken its toll over the last 300 years. "No need to be gentle, soldier. I know what has happened to the other lords." Belarius took a deep breath. Around him, he could sense some of the gazes pointed in his direction start to become hostile. These people had, after all, been driven from their homes and made to fight at the behest of creatures such as him, beings that had singularly failed in their divinely appointed mandates. He needed to do something to avoid things degenerating, and quickly. "Show me their bodies, please," he asked. "I would like to pay my respects to them." With a surprised look on his face, the soldier led Belarius toward the center of the camp, where the mortal remains of the two nobles had been brought by their loyal servants. The two bodies had been laid down next to each other, resting on small piles of wood. In death, Lady Miralis and Lord Dectarion looked very peaceful, free of whatever madness had caused them to kill each other. Both had regal, noble features. One of the corpses was a squid from the waist down, and the other was covered in black, manged fur from its canine-shaped head to its backward-jointed legs, and still wore their armor, with their weapons laid across their chest by their mourning followers. Belarius came to one knee, bowing before the dead lords, paying his respects with a silent prayer for their peaceful return to the realm of the gods now that their time on the mortal coil was ended. The soldiers around him fell silent as they saw him, some fell to their own knees to join him, and a few even started quietly sobbing. And just like that, the tension had been banished. A man who had seemed about to strike at him with his spear was one of those who had begun to cry, overcome by the sudden return of his sorrow at his master's demise. Belarius turned from the bier, and gently raised up the man's chin until they were looking each other in the eyes. "What is your name, soldier?" he asked, as softly as he could. "Marcus," replied the man, his voice quiet to the point of being almost inaudible. "Marcus. Do you know who I am?" The soldier looked at him in incomprehension, then his eyes fell on the sword on his waist and widened as understanding dawned behind them. Belarius saw the disbelief form first, then the awe, and Marcus fell to his knees once more, prostrating before the giant before him. Marcus had, of course, known that Belarius was a lord from the moment he had entered the camp. There was no mistaking someone his size for anything else. But now he had recognized the sword, and remembered the stories he had been told as a child, stories that had doubtlessly been circulating with renewed strength around the campfires among the armies gathered for this grand battle. "My lord," muttered Marcus, looking up at Belarius in adoration. You have returned? After all this time, we had begun to lose hope." "Yes," confirmed Belarius. "I have returned." Any doubt Belarius had on his mission were gone now. These soldiers, and countless more like them, had been driven into a battle they had no real desire to fight. The bonds of loyalty between them and their lords that should have been rewarded with rightful, benevolent guidance had been used to force them into killing their own kind. He could not allow it to continue, no matter the risks, no matter what the cost might be. The madness of the sovereigns and their vassals had to be put to an end. Belarius snatched a torch from one of them and, ceremoniously, brought it down upon the bier. The fire spread quickly, as did a sudden silence among the troops as they all turned toward him. He drew his sword and held it above his head, letting it catch the light of the bonfire. Once he was certain everyone in the camp was looking at him, he shouted, loud enough that they could all hear him. "I am Belarius. I am the destroyer of the shadow. For 300 years I have slumbered as my wounds healed, but now I have returned. As the gods' prophecy foretold, I shall put an end to the madness of my kindred and restore order and peace across Etheric. Your masters have fallen, slain not by each other, but by the madness that has come to them since the separation. Yet you still have a chance to make a difference, to make it so that such senseless violence never again taints Etheric's blessed soil. I intend to stop this coming war, to prevent the slaughter and restore the balance to this world. Join me, and together we will make the sovereigns bend knee and free them from the madness that has consumed them. Will you march with me?" The soldiers raised their own weapons and roared their approval. None of them asked Belarius how exactly he intended to do all of these things. He had given them hope, and a purpose, and that was enough. All of their lives, they had followed the commands of their lords without question. Now that these lords were dead, they were desperate for another to lead them, whether they realized it or not. And he would give them that purpose, but, he also swore to himself, he would never use them as their previous masters had. He would ensure that if any of them died under his command, it would be for something more than the whims of a mad godling. "My lord," said Marcus, worship evident on his face, "we are yours to command. What is your bidding?" As soon as he heard the question, a plan began to form in Belarius' mind, as if born of divine inspiration. He turned toward the distant shape of the monument, and pointed his sword in the direction of the obelisk. "We will march upon the pillar of sacrifice," he declared, trying to sound as imperious as possible, "and I shall speak with my kindred there, to free him of madness clutches and return to him the light of the gods. This I have decreed." More than 2,000 soldiers had fled in the woods, and they all answered Belarius' call. Rank upon rank of warriors marched through the forest once more, this time not in shameful retreat, but their hearts filled with pride and conviction. They had torn off their colored strips of cloth, symbolically casting off their ancient allegiances in favor of following Belarius to the victory and peace he had promised them. As they marched, Belarius focused his thoughts on the confrontation ahead. He had questioned Marcus on which of the sovereigns held the monument, and the soldiers' answers worried him. And the fact that Marcus had given signs that the other sovereigns were just as bad, if not worse, had done little to appease that worry. He was beginning to wonder if there was any chance of a peaceful resolution to Etharic's current crisis. The sovereign whose army waited at the foot of Belarius' tomb, Lord Nerkor, was the master of the city of Spires, now long since fallen to ruin. He had been alive 300 years ago, and his name caused some stirs in Belarius' shrouded memory. Perhaps the two of them had known each other. In that case, Belarius hoped a peaceful discussion was possible. But the rumors of Nerkor's madness that Marcus had reported made that an unlikely prospect. Before the separation, the city of Spires had been a prosperous harbor, a nexus of commerce between the nearby cities. Through Nerkor's leadership, the merchants had prospered, and through them the entire city and its surroundings. But when the gods had gone silent, Nerkor had begun to grow more and more erratic. Tax rates had randomly shifted, public buildings had collapsed for lack of maintenance, entire families were wiped out because of imaginary sins. The people of the city of Spires had lived in fear of their own ruler for generations, but that terror was balanced by a loyalty that, even now, was still strong. The very city owed its existence to the efforts of the sovereign, and the sheer size of the debt they owed him had prevented the people from departing it for greener pastures, not that there were any left on Etharic by that point. The camp spread for kilometers around the monument, surrounded by a deep trench and a wooden fence. There must have been tens of thousands of soldiers inside, and hundreds of them were watching over the ramparts. Reflecting the still considerable wealth of the city of Spires, these exemplars of Nerkor's army were clad in uniformed chain mail, and were armed with bows and long spears. Belarius could easily imagine how costly a direct assault on these walls would be, regardless of how primitive they might appear. The Lord of Etharic rose a hand, and commanded his forces to stop while still in the cover of the woods. Then, with only the soldiers closest to him as escort, he walked out into the open and marched slowly toward the nearest gate. As before, cries of alarm rose, but these were far more aggressive than those he had faced in the forest. Though Belarius was careful to appear as non-threatening as possible, bows were drawn and spears aimed at his chest, clutched in tightened fists. He stopped 12 meters from the gate, rose his sword high so that the sentinels could see the color of the blade, and declared, "I am Belarius. I am the Shadowslayer, returned after 300 years of slumber. I would speak with my brother Nerkor, whose brave soldiers have secured my monument in my absence." There was a moment of silence, then voices burst in alarm as his call was relayed throughout the camp. For several minutes, Belarius and his escort stood in place, waiting. Then the gates of the camp flew open, revealing a figure that could only be Lord Nerkor himself. The sovereign was tall, taller than Belarius even, and clad in heavy plates of grey armor engraved with minute script that told of the countless victories and honors this mighty lord had earned. In his hand, he held a two-handed sword, with the flat of the blade resting casually on his right shoulder as he advanced confidently toward Belarius. An obese giant, covered in flabs of flattened pustules, holding a giant, rusted cleaver, tied to a primitive hilt by strips of leather, and stopped when they were only a few steps from one another. For a few seconds, the two lords of Etharic stared at one another, unwilling to be the first to speak. It was the first time in his memory that Belarius met with another of his kin, and he found that the experience was unpleasant. Nerkor's aura of command was potent, even to him. The sovereign radiated majesty and confidence in waves, his armor shining in the light of the sun. He looked every bit the rightful lord that his followers believed him to be, save for the look on his face. His visage was distorted into an expression of hatred and stupor, as if he was painfully struggling to understand the world around him through a thick mist. "Belarius," he said, in a voice like the sound of rocks rumbling down a mountain to bury a village in the valley below. "Shadowslayer. You have come back." "Yes," replied Belarius, nodding slightly, his eyes still fixed in Nurkle's own, black and burning. "I have. This madness must end, brother. This war cannot be allowed to happen." Nurkle laughed then, a mirthless, cruel and desperate laugh all at once. "Do you think I don't know that, brother? Do you think I want to be here, preparing to fight against my own kin? None of us want that, dead one." "Then why are you here at all?" asked Belarius. Yet even as he spoke the question aloud, he felt a sickening dread form in his stomach, as if he already knew what the answer was going to be. "Isn't it obvious? We are all here because of you. The thrice-cursed prophecy of your return is the reason why we are here, Belarius. The priests all saw the same thing in their visions, after 300 years for us without receiving even a single word from our masters above. They told us all that they had seen you rise from your grave and come back to kill us, to end our reign and replace us as the sole steward of that world. Half of the other sovereigns are here in the hope that they can redeem themselves by joining you. The others are here to kill them before they can do this. As for me, I have come for you, Belarius." Nurkle brought his blade down onto the ground, where it buried itself several centimeters into the soft earth under its colossal weight. "The gods have already returned, brother," continued the sovereign, madness gleaming in his eyes. "We can sense their presence in the heavens, and the visions they sent to the priests confirmed that it wasn't another sign of our splintering minds. But they have discarded us, abandoned us. They will only favor you, you who slept while we suffered, you who didn't have to bear the burden they weren't here to help us carry. I will not be replaced." He roared suddenly, his neck bent so that he was screaming right to the heavens. "I will not be cast out. Do you hear me, my lords? I am not your instrument. I am not a puppet. I am a lord of Etheric." With a scream of rage, Nurkle charged toward a stupefied Belarius. He barely had time to dodge the down strike of the Svihendar, then to bring his own sword up to parry the next blow. His mind reeled with what Nurkle had said, with the implications of his words. Then there was no time for thought, as Lord and Sovereign tried their best to kill each other, while their soldiers watched on in mute horror. It only took a few seconds for Belarius to realize that he could not match Nurkle's physical strength. His opponent was far more heavily built than he was, and a single strike from his sword would cut Belarius in half. Fortunately, his emerald sword was capable of resisting even the full power of one of Nurkle's blows, but his own body would not, as his painfully throbbing arms informed him after the first parry. So Belarius fought to turn aside the strikes rather than block them fully. He moved on pure reaction, letting instincts that had been dormant for centuries rise to the fore and take control of his body. Though the battle had begun at Nurkle's advantage, Belarius slowly managed to turn the tide. Knowing he couldn't overpower his foe, he used his speed to dodge as often as he parried, and took advantage of the openings this created in Nurkle's guard to strike back at his foe. He only managed to inflict glancing blows that did little more beyond scratching the metal of Nurkle's armor, and enrage him even further. His attacks became less and less precise, but even a minor hit was enough to send Belarius reeling, blood gushing from his left arm. Snarling, Nurkle moved to finish him, rising his great sword high to strike it in a downward arc. But Belarius was quicker, and before the sovereign could bring his weapon down, he struck right at Nurkle's throat with his own sword, leaning forward to get the reach, knowing that if he missed, he would not have time to dodge a blow that would tear him to pieces. The emerald blade pierced through Nurkle's gorget in a shower of sparks, and ran through his throat. Dark, rich blood burst from the lethal wound in a torrent, and the sovereign's grip over his Svihendar slacked, letting the heavy weapon fall to the ground behind him as he himself collapsed to his knees, hands weakly trying to staunch the flow of blood. "I am sorry, brother," said Belarius, his breathing short and ragged by exertion. But it did not seem that Nurkle had heard him, for he merely stared up at the heavens once more. "I'm not a puppet." Nurkle's last words slurred from his mouth amidst a flow of blood, before the light faded from his eyes. As the sovereign died, Belarius sensed something shift in the air, and a wave of some indescribable emotion washed over him, spreading outward from the corpse in a circle. Nurkle's body relaxed and slumped to the ground, taking on the same peaceful appearance of the two dead lords Belarius had seen on the pyre. The only thing breaking the illusion that he was merely sleeping was the crimson fluid spread over his face. It seemed that death truly freed the lords from the grip of madness. Was that to be how he ended the plague of insanity among his kindred, then? Would he have to kill every single lord on Etheric until he was the last one standing? And was that exactly what Nurkor had foreseen, and sought to avoid by killing him before he could fulfill the god's prophecy? With the sovereign dead, his words before they had begun to fight returned to Belarius' mind. Had they been true, or simply the product of Nurkor's fevered mind? And if they were true, what should he do? His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of uncertain cheering coming from behind him, and weeping from in front. The shock of seeing him kill another lord had faded, replaced by elation in those who followed him, and horror in those who had followed Nurkor. "Surrender," he wheezed, still out of breath. After taking a deep lungful of blood-scented air, he shouted again at the camp, "Surrender. I command it." There was a floating instant of silence and uncertainty, as the soldiers on the walls were unsure how to respond. Belarius seized the moment, forcing his will upon them before the full realization of their lord's death hit them like it had the soldiers he had found in the woods. Standing straight, he walked slowly toward the open gate, trying his best to look as if he were simply entering into his own domain. The silence deepened as the soldiers of the city of Spires watched him stroll through their camp, which was much better organized and supplied than the last one he had visited. Rotten wood, bird fangs and claws, stinking meat hanging over fire pits, pale faces staring at him with feverish eyes. With soldiers pressing on the sides of the path Belarius was walking, but none daring to stand in his way. Behind the Lord of Etheric came a few of his soldiers, those who had been brave enough to follow him into what had been the enemy camp minutes ago, and might still be. Belarius was pleasantly surprised to see that Marcus was among them. Soon, they came in front of the monument, where Nurkor had raised his personal tent, a grand thing of crimson and azure tissue that still looked insignificant compared to the obelisk. The pillar of white stone shone in the light of day, the sun's rays illuminating the scenes that had been engraved upon it. Scenes depicting the highlights of Belarius' past life were side by side with columns of symbols that he couldn't read but that felt familiar. A ruined tower of steel and rockcrete, the sole remaining structure of the city that had once stood there, covered in moss and creeping plants, whose broken windows caused the wind passing through to sing mournfully. Several persons were waiting in front of the tent. 5 of them wore the armors of officers, and clung to the weapons hanging at their waist nervously. The 6th was an old crone, resting on a crooked wood staff for support and wearing a blindfold, yet her head was pointed straight in Belarius' direction nonetheless. The robe she wore reminded Belarius of the one Karalit had worn, though this one was grey instead of black. "Lord Belarius," said the woman, bowing slowly and visibly painfully. "I knew you would come." "That's the second time today I have been told my awakening was foretold," answered Belarius. "Are you a priestess of the gods?" "I am," she acquiesced. "My name is Nerul, Lord. I served Lord Nurkor for 50 years. I told him that he could not prevent the prophecy from coming to pass, but he did not listen to me. The burdens of his role as leader of the City of the Spires had done too much damage to his mind at the end. You did him a mercy when you released him from his mortal body and sent his spirit back to the divines." "Did I really?" muttered Belarius, before turning to the officers. "And you? Who are you?" The one in the middle stepped forward and took a knee, quickly imitated by the other 2. Though he was slightly trembling from facing the one who had slain his lord, he still looked up at Belarius with defiant eyes, unwilling to let his fear show on his face. When he spoke, his voice was loud and clear. "I am Captain Lest of the City of Spires. Me and my 2 colleagues are here to ask that you show mercy to the forces under our command in exchange for our surrender. He took a deep breath, forcing the next words to come out. "You defeated Lord Nurkor in honorable single combat, and I see that you are the one the prophecies spoke of. I will not stand in the way of the god's will, and I am ready to give you my life, but I ask that you spare my men from any punishment. They did not oppose you, and have committed no crime against the gods." "Is this what all of you think?" asked Belarius, looking at the 2 captains who had remained behind. Both of them nodded silently. He could sense their anger and their sorrow, but also the same thing he had felt in the forest camp, an underlying acceptance, a relief even. These soldiers had been loyal to Nurkor, but they had been under no illusion as to his mental state. Oaths of gratitude generations old had demanded that they fought for him, but in the end, they did not want to fight their countrymen any more than anyone else. "Then I accept your surrender, but I will not take your lives. Raise, and return to your troops. Weep." His announcement was interrupted by an alarmed call from the walls, where the sentries had finally turned their eyes away from the situation at the center of the camp and back to the outside. "They are coming. They are coming. The sovereigns are coming." Belarius froze for a few seconds, then rushed to the walls, the ranks of onlookers splitting before him while they themselves ran to get their weapons and armor. He climbed up the steps 3 at a time, Marcus right behind him. Immediately after reaching the top, he saw the other armies on the march, their banners raised high. The 6 remaining sovereigns of Etheric were making their move, converging on the monument with their vassals to take part in the final battle for the planet's fate. Judging by the banners' positions, each of the sovereigns had gathered his court of lords and ladies around him, forming an unbreakable core for his or her army. There was no more time for persuasion, no more time for duels and rallying speeches. Even though kilometers still separated the camp from the armies that marched toward it, Belarius could feel the souls of his brethren at the heart of each host, sense the weight of their decisions. The momentum of these armies would not be stopped. Had the other sovereigns sensed Nurkor's death in the same manner he had, and resolved to prevent the same fate from falling upon them? In the end, it mattered little. Every other path had just been closed forever, now only outright warfare could put an end to the insane reign of the lords of Etheric. Belarius looked at the armies again, trying to trace the paths each of them would take. By his estimations, all advancing forces would cross paths with at least one other group before reaching the fortified camp. It was possible that they would destroy each other, but also that they would join forces to prevent Belarius from fulfilling the prophecy. The Lord opened his mouth, about to shout his orders that the gates be opened so that the rest of his forces in the wood could come in, and then that everyone prepares for a defensive battle. But the words died on his tongue, and it was all that he could do to watch in terrified awe, as the judgment of the gods descended upon Etheric. It began with a pillar of fire coming down from the heavens. One moment, the entire armies of 2 sovereigns had been about to make contact, their lords leading the charge toward each other's. Then, in a blaze so bright it brought tears to Belarius' eyes, both courts disappeared, leaving naught but an enormous crater behind. Every remaining army stopped dead in its tracks, every eye locked onto the divine retribution that had just been unleashed. But that was only the first part, for next came angels, descending from the skies on wings of pure celestial light. With engines roaring, packs of gunships descended upon the 4 remaining armies. The angels landed near to the sovereigns, and even from afar, Belarius could see the brightness of their blades as they brought them down upon the insane lords of Etheric. The sound of bolter fire echoed across the desert plains, accompanied by the screams of the dying. Blade, gun, angels, gunships, golden armor, black giants, pain. Belarius screamed, feeling as if his head was being torn apart from the inside. Images flashed in his brain, and the scenery around him kept changing before he had a chance to understand what was going on. Finally, as he was leaning on the wall for support, his hands pressed against his throbbing eyes, the pain receded. Behind him, he heard a concerned voice calling out. He turned toward it, and recoiled in horror as he saw what Marcus had suddenly become. The soldier was gone, and in his place stood a grotesque caricature of a human being, a hunched, emaciated humanoid, with the head of a goat instead of a man's. 3-fingered claws ended long, 2 articulated limbs, and yet there was no mistaking the look of worship in the creature's yellow eyes as it looked upon Belarius. The Lord of Etheric looked around him, and saw that every single soldier in the camp had also transformed into a monstrous creature. No 2 were identical, but all shared the corruption and ugliness of the first. Abominable hybrids of human and animal forms were common, but there were others, unnameable horrors on display as well. Globulous eyes peering from exposed chests, skin that hung off muscle like melted wax, small holes into glowing flesh from which emanated small, greenish flames, and a carnival of other deformities. As Belarius saw these monsters, so too did they see him, and they reacted to his gaze with violent madness. They howled and shrieked, their twisted vocal cords somehow managing to get across the horror and despair they felt at what they had become. In the distance, the armies of the other lords were in similar throes, and the sounds of fighting could be heard amidst the choirs of laments as entire armies suddenly turned against themselves. Around the Lord of Etheric, things that had been men moments ago started to tear at each other's flesh and their own in a self-destructive rage. Belarius stumbled, shaken by the nightmarish vision, and lost his precarious footing on the pile of detritus that the wooden wall had become. He slipped down the entire thing and landed inside the camp. Trembling, he stood up and shook his head, trying to shake off the horror surrounding him, but his eyes fell upon a pool of blood, and he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the spilled vitae. Where before he had looked down upon his body and seen a perfect example of the human form, if a huge one, now the image in the reflection was that of a monster. His entire body was bulging with grotesquely inflated muscles, his arms reached down to the ground, and instead of holding a sword, as he had believed, his hands ended in a set of half-a-meter-long claws, dripping a foul-smelling green ichor and covered in the blood and guts of those he had slain. His skin was pale and covered with old scars, some of which had reopened in the battle and were now leaking a foul-smelling pale ichor. His face was elongated, and his eyes, instead of human globoculars, were two emerald that somehow still saw color perfectly well, while a filthy mane of white hair fell down his shoulders in a tangled mess. He wasn't wearing an ancient armor, but torn, dirty furs strapped around his waist. The only thing that had not changed was his size, for even on the ground, he still towered above the lesser monstrosities that scampered around him. He looked up, in despair, trying to escape the horrific sights all around him. But all he saw upward was that the skies were no longer blue, instead, they were filled with roiling crimson tides, and arcs of black lightning coursed through them in patterns that burned his mind. Belarius saw faces in these flashes as well, the monstrous avian visages of godlike creatures who looked down upon Etheric and laughed at what they beheld. Belarius screamed, over and over, trying vainly to expel the horror he felt. He rolled on the ground, shaking uncontrollably, until his sight fell upon a familiar priest clad in black robes. Karalit was here. Somehow, the old man had managed to come here. Relief flooded Belarius, and he crawled toward the priest, desperate for his aid. Karalit knew so much about Etheric, surely he would know what was going on, he would know how to make it better. He wasn't a priest at all. Instead, he was a figure in black, baroque armor, almost as tall as Belarius himself and towering above his crawling form, holding in his hands an 8-pointed mace. Both weapon and armor were inscribed with flaring runes that burned Belarius' eyes. The apparition's face was bare, revealing a nightmarish patchwork of skin, some of which was pale and sickly, while the rest was either horribly charred or smooth as that of a newborn. "No," whispered Belarius. "No, no, no, no." "Yes," said the giant in a cruel and amused tone. "Yes, it is true. All that you saw before is a lie. This is your reality, my lord. And it is time you face it." "No," murmured the stricken mutant. "Stop it. Please. Your people were not created by the gods," continued the giant mercilessly. "They came here from another world, thousands of years ago. And you and your kind aren't divine envoys, crafted to guide those below you by the hands of the gods themselves. You are those who adapted best to the mutagenic plague that was unleashed upon this world when the storm engulfed it. You were transfigured, and gained great power and longevity, as well as the best way possible to control those who reacted to the plague by becoming this." The black-armored man gestured toward the teeming hordes all around them, who had started to howl in agony at about the same time Belarius had started to see reality once more. "They are the descendants of this world's populace when the plague struck, Belarius. And each of them knows, deep inside, that he or she is nothing more than a twisted abomination. Why do you think they flocked to you so eagerly after their lords died?" Belarius remained silent, shocked beyond words. Karalit continued. "It wasn't because of your commanding presence. Oh no, no matter what your delusion might have rationalized it as. It was because only by being near one of your kind can they be dragged into your madness, and escape the horror of their true existence, a horror so great, they willingly let you and your kind rewrite their memories to fit into your delusions. Their loyalty and devotion are the price they pay to continue the lie that make their lives bearable. And now that this illusion is gone, they are unable to cope with the truth. It has happened before, 300 years ago, in fact. When the lords first met, and their delusions clashed, they began to catch glimpses of the truth behind the veil of madness, and they started to kill each other until they were few enough in numbers that their dreams could align with one another." "Why?" moaned Belarius. "Why would this happen? How could this happen?" "That is not for the likes of you and I to know," shrugged the false priest. "Maybe it was because of the manner of research that was conducted on this planet. Maybe it was because of the remnant of some grand experiment conducted by the settlers of this world thousands of years ago, awakened by the power of the storm. The gods have their own designs for us mere mortals, and it is not our place to question our part in them, especially those of the Changer of Ways, whose minions held dominion over this world. But shouldn't you be happy, Belarius? You have been chosen, not to be some great savior of legends, of course, that was simply a convenient way to make you do what needed to be done. But you have been chosen to be bestowed a power that only a few on this world have been judged worthy of, Karalit went on, his voice suddenly filled with religious rapture. And you have been chosen again, this time by me, to become the new master of this world. What do you mean? The black warrior lurched forward, still looking down on Belarius' prostrated form, and the words he spoke next burned into the mind of the deceived hero. I can give you back your dream, little Belarius. I can wipe away the horrible knowledge that is consuming you now. All I ask in return is your loyalty. Karalit held out his gauntleted hand toward Belarius, open palm facing up. The mutant looked at the offered hand, transfixed. For a long time, the two of them simply stood still, while all around them, the twisted hordes continued to rend each other apart. Then, with trembling fingers, Belarius reached out to Karalit's hand. The gauntlet clasped around his wrist, and Karalit rose his Crozius toward the swirling skies. The weapon began to glow with fell power, and Karalit spoke words of a language that was at once unknown to Belarius yet resonated with his soul. And at the priest's touch, a golden light pulsed from Belarius' wounded body, healing him as the holy man stirred his God-given powers to action. Belarius rose to his feet, resplendent in his armor, and rose his sword high, letting it shine in the light of the sun, bright enough for all on the field to see. Behind him, Karalit, who had left his sanctuary at the risk of his own life in order to assist him, retreated, letting him do what he had been destined to do. All over the field of battle, the soldiers saw the beacon, and they ceased their battle at once, falling to their knees before Belarius' radiant form. The panic and horror that had filled them after the tragic demise of their lord was banished, and they remembered their place and honor. As one, they fell to their knees, bowing their head to their new sovereign. Childhood memories of the sleeping lord's legend came back to their minds, and they realized the identity of this champion. Soon, they began to chant his name, over and over. Belarius. 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 A sense of deep contentment washed over him at the sight, and he knew that all was well. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and the compact between the people of Etheric and the gods had been restored, though it had come at the cost of every other lord. In time, the gods would send more, but until then it would fall to him to carry the gods' words to the people of Etheric. He could hear them already, whispering in the back of his mind, letting their divine knowledge permeate his thoughts so that he could guide the children of Etheric to their rightful destiny. The ship hung in orbit around Etheric 1, alone among the wreckage of destroyed orbital platforms and other man-made satellites that had, somehow, survived the fury of the storm. An expert eye, and one able to look upon what the vessel had become without going mad, would have recognized the hull as belonging to the Dauntless class of light cruisers, but it had changed much since the ship had left the docks of the Martian shipyard that had built her. Now it was a sleek, predatory thing, its shape twisted by the demon that had replaced its machine spirit. Once, she had borne the name of Liberation's Price with pride, and served as one of the defenders of the Paraxis system. But after her capture, the Forsaken Sons warpsmiths had summoned a powerful warp entity and bound it within the hull. What had emerged from this unholy union was a monster of the void, a twisted and cruel reflection of the majesty the ship had once possessed, now called price of servitude by those who struggled to command it. It had taken time for those assigned to the ship to obtain anything approaching mastery over it. Even now, dozens of crew members were lost each week to dark corridors and hungry walls of flesh. But the hold of the demon had been lessened enough, through the use of sorcerer swords and ritual offerings, that it was possible at all for mortals to inhabit its holds. And the advantages were nothing to scoff at. Indeed, without the demon's instincts guiding the ship through the warp, it would have been all but impossible for it to cross space without a navigator. The ship also did not require as much qualified crew as its class would have indicated, leaving entire decks empty for its masters to fill with the spoils of their conquest. A skeleton crew of a few hundreds was enough to keep it running, where tens of thousands would have been required prior to its possession. On the bridge of the price of servitude, Dark Apostle Karalit looked at the world he and his brother had claimed for the Warband through an oculus threaded with fleshy veins and glass imbued with the wonders of the warp. Where a lesser mind would have gotten nothing more from looking than a headache, he could see the patterns the oculus revealed. He had studied them extensively before they had even landed on the planet, learning the flux of energy on the world below, noting the places of power and those marked by ancient tragedies. Now, as he looked, he could see the consequences of what they had done written large upon the skein of the world's soul. The sound of ceramite boots on the deck's metal drew his attention back to his surroundings, and he turned to face the only other soul aboard the ship worthy of the god's attention. As usual, when he saw the scaled, sea-green armor, he had to repress an instinctual surge of hatred, of desire to strike at the one in front of him and cast him down. But he resisted, reminding himself of the consequences such an act would have, even if he was successful, which was far from a certitude. "If one of you returns without the other, I will kill him myself." Such had been the last words spoken by Archon the Awakened One, supreme warlord of the Forsaken Sons. Two of his lieutenants had left together on a crusade of conquest across the Wailing Storm. Karalit, formerly of the Word-Bearers, and Decaros, formerly of the Alpha Legion. Technically, Decaros was in command of the Warband's splinter group. 200 Astartes had been detached to his command, the maximum that could be loaded aboard the Price of Servitude with its diminished crew. The two leaders both disliked the other, but it wasn't personal. If anything, it was a legacy of the legions to which they had belonged before joining the Forsaken Sons and no longer owed any allegiance to. To Karalit, the Lord of Shadow was an individual woefully lacking in conviction, bringing others to his side by offering petty things such as wealth and temporal power. At the same time, Karalit knew that in Decaro's eyes, he and the rest of the former word-bearers in the Warband were little more than fanatics, dangerously unhinged and unstable. Part of him understood why the son of Valfarius would believe such a thing. He and his Gene brothers had always been enthusiastic in their convictions. There was something in the bloodline of Lorga that made them more zealous than their cousins, and the revelation of the primordial truth had only exacerbated that trait. Even Karalit now recognized that he had let himself be carried away by the knowledge that he fought for the one truth, and believed himself to be the champion of the gods rather than their servant. But he had paid the price for that hubris in the battle for Asthena, and been taught humility. The flames of the son of Kalth who had felled him had burned his flesh, boiled his eyes away, and left him a charred wreck of mindless agony. But the power of the gods, still coursing through his veins after the victory against a dreadnought he had scored moments before his defeat, had kept him from death. The Fleshmasters had found him after the battle, shocked that he still lived at all, and brought him back aboard the Hand of Ruin. There they had worked to restoring him, using all of their craft to do so. Mundane healing had proved to be useless, and so they had turned to other means. In a last-ditch attempt to save him before putting him in one of the newly repaired dreadnought chassis, they Fleshmasters had hooked Karalitz up to a drip of demonic ichor and other warp-born substances, letting the will of the gods decide his fate. Though they had not told him, the Dark Apostle knew that he had been under watch by heavily armed servitors the entire time, ready to tear him to shreds if he ever lost his identity to the flux of chaotic energy and transformed into a mutated, mindless spawn. If such had been his fate, he would have welcomed death rather than suffer such indignity. But Karalit had endured, and had risen from near death as a new being, bearing the marks his trial had left upon his flesh with pride. During the agonized process of his rebirth, he had witnessed the true glories of chaos, and been shown his place in the designs of the gods. His was not the destiny of the conqueror, to bring fire and ruin to entire systems as he offered them up to the primordial annihilator in sacrifice. Nor was he to turn billions of weak-willed fools to the one true faith with fiery oratory and displays of temporal power. No, his part in the great plan of chaos was as an agent of subtler, more select corruption. He was destined to be an artisan of souls, crafting others into champions of the dark gods by manipulating their paths. It had been Decaros who had worked in the shadows to increase tensions between the mutant lords and prepared the deployment of the 200 Astartes under his command during the final battle. But it had fallen to Karalit to ensure that the battle would actually take place, to plant the seed of visions into the minds of the priest caste serving the creatures calling themselves the Lords of Etheric. It had been his role to ensure that once the dust of the carnage fell back to the ground, there was still one mutant lord alive to control the hordes, one the Forsaken Sons could control themselves. He had done so on Etheric, locating the lost soul buried beneath the ruins of the capital and digging it free before setting it down the path that had led it right in the middle of the conflict. With subtle touches of sorcery, he had lifted the veil of madness from the eyes of the ruined man, Each glimpse of the true horror of his reality had been deliberately calculated so that doubt would grow slowly within him even as his conscious mind dismissed them, until the final moment, when the Lord of Ashes had shattered the illusion and forced his creation to confront the full truth. When the Forsaken Sons had finally struck at the sovereigns, Belarius' mind had been unable to invent an explanation that fitted into his delirium, and his tortured sanity had emerged again. That had been enough, for Belarius Nemeter, firstborn son of the last governor of Etheric and last of his illustrious bloodlines, which went back to before the days of the Long Night, had never possessed the strength to face reality. Even before the Wailing Storm had severed the sector from the rest of the Imperium, he had always preferred to flee the weight of responsibilities that came with his position. When the great hive cities had collapsed and the quakes brought forth by the storm, when the mutagenic agents hidden in the subterranean laboratories had been released into the atmosphere, Belarius Nemeter had been drinking alone in his chambers, too drunk to even notice when the structure collapsed and he was trapped beneath tons of rubble. And now, trapped once more in the sorceries Karalit had woven around his willing, desperate mind, he would never have to face reality again. The lie Karalit had created for him, where he was a prophesied king, was too strong a lure for him to resist. Belarius' own mind would create the details of his past, and he would truly believe them to be the truth, just like all the other lords had believed their own rewritten memories. He would rule over the world of his ancestors, a puppet king to the Forsaken Sons, his own delusions spread across the planet by the strange powers bestowed to his kin by the mutagenic agents. He would send his subjects to the stars aboard primitive ships that the Dark Magi aboard the Price were teaching them to build. These heretics were posing as emissaries from the angelic warriors who had come to Etheric to help end the destructive civil wars of the previous lords, and offer the population of that world a chance to be part of something greater. After all, the best lies were the ones that contained a measure of truth as their core. Entrapped in the madness that had been the gods' sole mercy on their world, these mutants would fight and die in what they would see as righteous crusades against horrid monsters, never aware of the truth. Communicating with their deluded lords would doubtlessly prove annoying, but the children of Etheric were strong enough that their service was worth such a price. And even now, the Flesh Masters were at work on the corpses of the lords the Forsaken Sons had slain on Etheric, piecing together the secret of their unique mutations and mind-controlling gifts. There was no telling what dark wonders the former apothecaries would be able to concoct with such material at their disposition, but the Dark Apostle had no doubt that they would be useful to the future campaigns of the Warband. Karalit tore his attention away from the past and back to Decaros. "We will remain in this system for the next few months," said the Lord of Shadows, "but the hardest part of our work here is done. All that remains is for our heretic servants to work, and for us to reap the rewards of our efforts," agreed Karalit. "Archon will be pleased with what you and I have accomplished here." "Yes, but this is a minor offering at best," pointed out the son of Alpharius, gesturing at the planet below. "These mutants are good fighters for mortals, I will give them that, but the Warband already has plenty of bolter fodder, and we have shipyards working on building much better ships that these wretches will be able to put together." "You lack imagination, cousin," replied Karalit, and he sensed Decaro's anger at the jab, but ignored it as he continued, "There is much more to them than simple military power. Their gift from the gods could, under the proper circumstances, be spread to other mortals." The Lords of Shadows and Ashes both fell silent as they contemplated the implications of such a possibility. Though he had already considered them long ago, Karalit still felt a smile form on his lips at the mental image, and soon, a similar expression formed on Decaro's face. Then they started to laugh together, a cruel and inhumane sound that promised the damnation of entire worlds. With neither of them noticing that the greatest damnation was their own.